Okay, this is episode, insert the number of the episode, because I don't know when it will be released. So I wouldn't be as presumptuous enough as I might have been in what I told you was episode 9, but in fact was in no way episode 9. It wasn't even episode 10, wasn't even episode 11. It was just episode whatever I felt like it was. And actually the sad thing about that was I even could have just planned out, couldn't I? Like, it's going to be 4 weeks from now, this is episode X, like add 4 to X and gotten a number Y. See, believe it or not, kids who learn algebra and teachers, it's not actually a very good system, is it? Just using some sort of a representation like that, because you don't know what the representation means. So you basically just have to remember whatever it meant anyway. So she just said the number. So this is a show sponsored by esportspools, and don't really have that much more to say about that, you know, because I mean, like, what jokes is there even left? Like, first of all, I don't even know. Probably NALCS is probably the next big tournament they'll be doing there, I assume. So that's a while from now, you know. And obviously we know that's actually not a competitive league anymore. I mean, how could I in good faith tell you to bet on any of the results for NALCS when it turns out that actually one person owns 3 of the teams? So, you know, I wouldn't want to be taking part in any sort of criminal activity that ever could lend to me being issued a subpoena to come into court and explain to people the great features of esports pools, like fantasy betting, like actually esports contests where you pick the lineup, you know, that you think's the best, and then you see how they do in a competition. Obviously, if you're absolutely fucking delusional, what you actually do is you just have like 5 players you know personally and have worked with, and you just secretly harbour the opinion that all 5 of them are really the good or among the best at their roles. And then if you're really shrewd, you don't like learn, like, you know, the nuance of perhaps you just know this guy better and, you know, you watched him grow up from the challenger scene. What you do is the only nuance you learn is you just don't tell everyone that you think all of them are the best at their position. You just wait until gradually each has like a pop-off game or starts to get some team accomplishments, and then you start to let it slip that you at least think they're on the same level as all the people established consensus opinion are the best at that role. But even so, you don't let the game slip just yet. You wait until you draw SK Telecom in the round of 8. Well, that's a bit too specific, really. Like, that wouldn't, I guess that wouldn't really make any sense for anyone else's story, so I don't know why I even brought that up. Just what you do, though, you can see what you do. There's sort of a gradual path. And then at the end of it all, when people think you're the best, somehow you don't recant any of that, because that's the part that never made any sense to me. Like, my move would be, I'd keep all my players humble. Like, you know, you guys are grinding, working. Who cares what people think? Like, the opinions, you know, let's just get the trophy. Like, don't worry about that, you know. And at the end, obviously, I'd be like, no, you know, I was working with a lot of rookies, a lot of guys who hadn't made it, you know, bless them. They try so hard, but, you know, I tell you what, I have to put in a lot of hours to coach them to be fucking good at this game. But, you know, I mean, I'm not going to blow my own trumpet. You know, they'd have to do that for me if you ever were, in fact, to talk to them. I don't talk to the Hussain guy. He's French, so he's not going to tell you anything. But if you ever talk to anyone that are, like, really my mates, they'd tell you we're sick. I'm really good at this. But no, you went the other approach on that one, and what do you even do, basically? I mean, the players are just so good, right, Hussain? The team's just so good. They turned out they were always good. Everyone who didn't know they were good, like reality, results, the standings, power rankings, all the experts in the world, the other 3 teams in your group, you know, most of the teams at the World Championship, including SK Telecom, including people in SK Telecom who shouldn't even be in the lineup and somehow still scored wins. But, you know, aside from all those people, your team's fucking good, and you must be pretty sick. So yeah, as everyone can tell, this is an episode. It's not just an extended roast. That's just why I call it. But this is an episode about why were Misfits so good at Worlds. Now, I might have tricked Hussain here, because I might have said the episode was about why Misfits did so well at Worlds, which is actually, it sounds very similar, doesn't it? You know, if you're not looking at the semantics. But my one sort of carries a sinister implication that maybe they weren't so good. But that's for us to discuss and to decide on the battlefield of public opinions, which is not the new name of my new series I'm doing with Kelsey Moser, in which everyone, regular co-host, everyone will simply comment either on the fact that she has an annoying voice. I mean, first of all, have you ever heard my voice? Do you think in school that I was loving shit? You think people were just going, he seems like a cool guy, just by the way he looks and the way he appears audially? No, people were saying, well, sadly, look, in my school, like, we didn't really have, like, lockers, so you couldn't get shoved them. So I guess that's an upside, right, of not being in American high schools in the 1980s around the Bay Area, which has warped everyone through media. So let's start on this level, Hussain. Whenever we discuss any team, I always think it's really good if we get, like, some basic definitions of where people are at on the team, because otherwise you go into these discussions and you find something out like half an hour in that changes everything. Like you find out that actually Loco Doco thinks that Amazing had 9.5 out of 10 mechanics as just a player in League of Legends, not even a jungler, and even then doubles down that is in the context of Faker, you know, probably the best player ever, having 10 out of 10 mechanics. You know, it wasn't like 9.5 out of a 20 scale. It was out of 10, you know. Basically, Faker is but, you know, one small twist of the DNA helix away from Amazing, apparently. So if you know that, then first of all, in a way, it sort of inoculates you against the rest of the person's fucking madness before that spreads. And then secondly, perhaps it allows us, much like an inoculating injection, to create some sort of a cure to help them, because God knows they need it. Although then again, maybe the Golden Guardians could just buy every team in the world and hire that person. Don't know why I said that person. I've already said it's Loco, and I already implied that he is in fact mentally ill, but in a way that I love. I mean, a lot of the best people are mentally ill. What is mental illness? Who knows? It's not the topic of this episode though. So Hussain, let's start here, okay? Right, coming into Worlds, there's a reason why no one was like bigging up Misfits. In fact, I think on the episode we did with all the people we had on, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but Kelsey, wasn't it only Veteran who actually even thought they were going to...
No, it was Gilius.
Gilius. What, did Veteran actually pick them to get out? I don't think he did.
He wasn't on that episode.
Right, so. Yes, okay. Well,
he was on almost every other episode.
It does feel like that, doesn't it? In some ways, I'm waiting for him to just start telling us some shit.
I thought Gilius had Flash Wolf second and Will Delete first.
I don't think he trolled that hard, did he?
I think, no. So most people had TSM and WE, I think.
He was the only one who didn't have TSM, I believe, yes. I think someone else might have not had WE, though. But I'm trying to think.
Yeah, I think someone didn't. I think someone had TSM and Flash Wolves or something. I don't remember exactly.
Yes, it would be Nelson. Most people the guy who came from Singapore or something. Okay, right. Anyway, the point I'm getting at there is, of all the people we had on, I actually don't know a single person who, except maybe Gilius in this scenario, who, like, to be fair, I'm with Hussain on that one. It sounds like he'd just go straight fucking jealousy on that one and wouldn't pick them because it's like, Europeans, aren't they? Oh, all Europeans are shit except me. But am I really European? Another episode again there, Thorin. Timestamp that, take that out. Okay. Anyway, just a thought. I'm just full of questions, you know, that's the thing with me. My problem is I used to answer questions before. When you answer questions, that can get you killed. If you just pose questions, like, weird. Seems as if the Earth goes around the sun, and the church is like, you what? And you just go, don't know, just spitballing. Anyway, enough about that. You guys decide it. See it. So let's start here then, Hussain. The point is, no one as a team thought your team was that good. If we just go and look at the EU LCS, you know, my favourite system of metric for deciding good players, the EU LCS All LCS Awards, you'd barely know Misfits fucking exists. Because guess what? They were decided before the playoffs. And some would say, Hussain, that in many ways, your team was sort of like, I think it was like an old 80s video by... What group was that? Was it like Aha or something? There's some group where the video starts out and it's in black and white, and then they touch like a mirror and go into it, and it's all colour in there. That was the playoffs of the ULCS summer for you, because before that, your team was just some like getting along team. Maybe they're going to do okay, you know. Small chance at an upset, perhaps. Probably should just lose in the first round. Most people didn't think all the players were that good. So, as someone who's the coach of this team, and obviously the team hasn't been in LCS for long, realistically, how good was the team and how good were the players in the summer split? What's your take? What's your perspective? Let us inside your world.
I think during the regular split, we were probably like 5th or 6th. For most of the split, Fnatic and G2 were like the best, by far the best teams. HTK was up there. Splice was like weird, like they were up and down. And then there was Unicorns that seemed good, and then they just completely bombed. So I think most people had us out of, or didn't predict anything from us for playoffs and Worlds, because rightfully so, they didn't have any reason to based off our regular season. Okay. But with that said, I think the part that people missed is like, if you look at like even in spring split and in summer split, going into playoffs, neither of those times anyone thought we would do anything at playoffs. And for both spring and summer, we were a lot better at playoffs, just in our level of play. Not necessarily in results, but in the level of play than we were in regular split. Okay. And that's generally because of how like honestly, regular split doesn't that matter that much, and it's like completely different prepping for a tournament structure where you actually prep for teams, and we were better at that than most teams in Europe. So if people took that into account, I think maybe they would have ranked us differently for Worlds, but I think way too much emphasis is put on regular split overall as opposed to how well teams or rosters do for playoffs.
Okay, wait a second. I have to stop you right there. So here's the question I have, okay, is that's all well and good, right? It's basically the sort of regional version of the old, what I call ye old sailors chant of G2. And it goes like this, we suck at the best ones, but if we'd have gotten to the best of 5 stage, we are sick, It's not very catchy, but somehow they manage to remember the words every year. The implication is like, no, we're really sick in real series. What's the problem then? Just win the World Championship. You got to bloody get to the series, haven't you? We keep fucking losing the best ones. Bloody. Now, the problem with that logic, right, Hussain, is, there are some teams. G2's a good one. Believe it or not, this team called TSM that not many people have heard of. They're actually a good example of it as well. Actually not a bad team, but, keep getting lost in the best of ones. The problem is, though, if you look at the best teams of all time, whether it's regionally in Europe or whether it's internationally, they're also pretty fucking good at the old best of ones in the regular seasons as well. Like the only example I can actually think of in the history of like European LCS of a team who wasn't that good in the group stage or in the regular season. And in this case, it actually wasn't even always the case. It was with gradual diminishing returns. It was obviously the like SOAS and Expeke, Fnatic, and then Origin teams. Because yes, by the end, they probably did push it as far as you could to not really sort of practice properly and not put in the time and then get it together for the playoffs and know that, poise and these sorts of factors could help you get past people. But even then, first of all, when they were at their peak, arguably they were good in the group stages and the rest of the regular seasons, So come on, give us some reasons why then. Because on the outside, that sounds like you would be a pretty big outlier if you were the team that was somehow like amazing in playoff type scenarios, but just couldn't do it in the massive sample size of the regular season. So what factors play into that?
Because like if you consider group stage, first of all, like G2's failures in group stages are in a tournament structure. It's not a league system, and it's 2 out of 4. And for making playoffs in a league system, you just need to be 6 out of 10, and that's a big. A big room where you have a lot of area to make it into playoffs. So the pressure to make it into playoffs is not that high. There's rarely ever been a split in EU, or at least for not for a while, where the bottom 4 or 5 teams are competitive enough to make playoffs actually a scary, or making playoffs like a scary thought. Sure. So with that in mind, it's our first year in LCS, and that means that we can take the approach of that some teams have taken, where the first year results are the only thing that matters. So you invest a lot of money, you bring in a lot of players, and you buy star power, which a couple of teams in the NA franchise are trying to do, and you essentially try to zone in on having the best team possible right away, or you take it from an org point of view, which is you build certain systems, whether that's in game or out of game, whether that's in terms of coaching or even an organization structure that allows for replacements, that allows for slower growth maybe. But I'm not saying that we were some hidden dark horse. We were going in the hyperbolic time chamber through regular split, just waiting to show what we can do in playoffs, but more so that we were pretty certain we would make playoffs, and we never actually, very rarely did we actually take the time to prepare for teams in regular split, in the sense that we are specifically preparing a whole week of practice and strategy to beat this one team, which is what we generally do for playoff and world structures. And so with that in mind, the amount of time you actually spend just becoming a good team generally versus a good team against certain opponents, does drastically change how you play and the results that shows.
Okay.
So I think one interesting thing about Misfits between regular season and playoffs is that there was definitely a transformation between how the mid and jungle were working together. And I think it could have been something as simple as, Unicorns of Love have this very clear thing that we can sort of play around. So on top of everything else, building Maxler around lanes and his decision making with when he's going to ward, when he's going to invade, when he's going to farm, when he's going to gank, whatever. And then on top of that, there's a very obvious way to approach Unicorns of Love, which is to kind of give power people the ability to have mid priority and make this a very big important thing. And I feel like after you had success with that, it just sort of became something that you focused on a lot more in your games as well. So for me, I think that playing against Unicorns of Love was somewhat beneficial for you guys in realizing like how important you want mid push to be and using that very well across the map. So that's kind of like my take on it, but I don't know what your thoughts would be on that.
Well, we realized like how to fix our mid jungle leading up to Unicorns. Like we recognized that as an issue pretty early on, but there were a lot of things to fix in the team like the 2 weeks before playoffs. There was a lot of work to be done. And for Unicorn specifically, we knew that like if we had good mid jungle matchups or good mid jungle synergy, then Unicorns was going to be very easy because their champion pools are easy to exploit. And considering that like the last week of LCS didn't really matter for us, a lot of like we had like I don't remember if it was 2 or 3 weeks to prepare for just Unicorns, and 2 or 3 weeks to fix just mid jungle, which is not something that just like helps beat Unicorns. Having good mid jungle like transfers into everything, and it's not just Unicorns. Like it's historically been true that like quite often, if it's a playoff or tournament structure, the first game we play in any tournament teaches us a lot about how to play like the rest of that portion. Like even for group stage, our game against World Elite was like the most important loss we've ever had because it defined what we needed to do for group stage. And it was the same with Unicorns, where we knew how to beat them, but doing it on stage versus like knowing how to do it are 2 very different things. And Unicorns taught us how to do it on stage.
Okay. Because here's the thing, Kelsey, like, correct me if I'm wrong when I categorize it like this, or characterize it like this, rather.
Sure.
It sounds to me, and I already suspected this from the way you commented on Misfits in some of the past shows, where while everyone else was, like, obviously riding high on the hype train of, like, the idea that, like, wow, like, maybe they were the best Western team there, like, you know, all this sort of jazz. I noticed that it sounded to me like you see their team and their rise through the summer split playoffs, through to Worlds, in a similar fashion to how you've characterized what happened to Samsung, where actually it was the early opponents that they played that they had to either, in the case of Samsung, actually just lose to in RNG, or in this case they had to obviously beat Unicorns Love. We'd never have seen them here in Misfits. Somehow playing these early opponents and then the other opponents actually literally was sort of what leveled them up or pushed them in the direction. You could go that route as well. You could say it kind of forced them down a certain evolution path, which later on yielded the team that then could have the big results. Obviously, in Samsung's case, they actually won Worlds from it. You know, I realize that's like the Korean. That's called success in Korea, actually, to win the World Championship. You know, it's not just to be the last team to draw Koreans, or apparently in Cloud9's case, to just lose to one of the not that great Chinese teams is success. But I don't know. Anyway, point is, success is a very subjective thing. But is that? Do you see something similar for Misfits?
I think to an extent the Unicorns games were very helpful because it opened a way to play the game that was not just effective against Unicorns of Love, but against a lot of teams, like you said, because Unicorns had a very specific weakness. But I wouldn't say it's necessarily just the specific teams that they faced so much as the way I also wrote an article where I sort of characterized Misfits and Fnatic as teams that took a very different approach to group stage. In particular, I would say that Fnatic, for them, they're always a team that talks about how emotional they are and how important winning like every single game is. And so for them, they wanted to find something that worked for them and that they could guarantee that they would win like almost every single game. And they didn't necessarily spend a lot of time like working on the system or working on stuff that they were bad at or putting themselves out of their comfort zone. Whereas I felt like, I think it was like one of the first games of the summer split where Misfits were suddenly playing like these 1-3-1, and then the Corky lane assignment was kind of weird and everything else. And it was just like, why are they doing this? But it's just Misfits wanted to make themselves more well-rounded was kind of the way that I looked at it. And then it eventually, like, it was almost coincidental that a lot of the stuff they were working on came together really well for playoffs. Maybe that was, as he said, because they had a block of time where they stopped caring so much about the games in the regular season. But that's kind of how it felt to me in terms of looking at Misfits and their growth.
I mean, it's also true because, like, in Spring Split, we were a very linear team, mostly because it was hard to communicate with Kakao. And for Spring Split, that was fine because it's our first split, and I didn't care if we weren't well-rounded, so much so that the rookies on the team got good experience on LCS stage. And with that said, like, it was really hard to prepare for spring playoffs because there were such specific conditions under which we could perform that preparing for any opponent was hard. It was more so just trying to find drafts that got us what we wanted in the best scenarios possible. And that's like, you can't perform in any tournament structure like that. Like, you'll maybe get to a certain point, but you're not going to win the whole thing. Or at least, like, if you want to attempt to, you won't be able to. Even Fnatic tried that in Spring Split with their reckless comms. So I've always been a fan of like how G2 approaches games, and we kind of want to do the same thing as well for ourselves. And even though G2 had 2 Koreans, their communication was always very important to how G2 played.
Okay,
and
so how was that different from how the other teams prepared, to your knowledge, then? Or how they advanced their agenda or figure out what they're going to do as a team?
Because it could be anything from like prioritizing player comfort too much, which in Fnatic's case, historically they have done. With like any given roster, they've pretty much prioritized player comfort over what the meta is, unless it's just impossible to play that. Unicorns is the same thing. They play like this specific style that will sometimes work and sometimes won't. None of these teams have necessarily improved like the fundamentals of League of Legends over time that much. Fnatic has tried, especially in Summer Split, like they try to do it, but over the history of teams, only Splice has tried it, G2 and us, I think, in the past few splits. And with that said, I think G2, us, and Splice were the best teams at playoffs in Summer Split. So I think eventually Europe has to go towards that. Like, it's how Korea plays the game. Like, you don't need to play League of Legends the same way, but the fundamentals of League stay the same, and then you cater your team's strengths and weaknesses to that. And in the West, you can play to player comfort and get away with it because the top teams aren't necessarily good enough to punish it.
Okay. So this is why, for example, we see, I mean, it happens pretty much every single big international tournament. You have some player who's in like a Western region, obviously Europe or North America, who's like an elite player, usually actually very much the ones who've been established a long time, where you think to yourself, this is bizarre because I know everyone would rank this guy a top 10 position X in the world, and yet they don't play some like super strong meta pick, or they just refuse to actually seem to either play against or with it, and you get these weird little like black holes there where actually it's very rare in like LPL or LCK that the top 3 player at that position would just avoid those things. Maybe you play it badly or occasionally, but you never really have the ones where, I mean, the examples would be like last year, like Lucian, the pocket pick of double lift, where it's like, yeah, well, it isn't, is it? What happens is double lift is so good, and at that point in time was so good, in a team that's so good, he can just do what he wants with that. But it's actually kind of a way, he's almost training himself not to do well at Worlds because he's not going to be doing it there, and no one else gives a fuck because they know it doesn't work at the highest level. I realize I crowbarred that a little bit, but is that along the lines of what you're talking about? Sort
of. Like, there's certain teams that care about doing as well as they can in a tournament, and then there are some teams that believe that what they're doing is just straight up better than like what everyone else is trying to do, so they'll stick to it. And then there's some teams that follow the game in a similar sense to the Koreans, not exactly the same way, but in a similar sense. And historically, the Korean teams have played League the best, and that's because it doesn't matter what the meta is or what the champions are. Like, every top team in Korea will play every single meta champion, and then which of the meta champions they prioritize depends on the strengths of the team. So like, that doesn't mean Rox Tigers ever played like SKT, but the fundamentals of both teams was the same. The way they played League of Legends was the same. There's just the champions they prioritized, and therefore lanes and everything else was different. Well, and if you want to give that example, because that's a great example, obviously, because that was a team that literally could have been the world champion a couple of times over, obviously was LCK champion and could have had many more titles. This is a team where I always thought that's like a perfect analogy for why Korean teams are different to Western teams. Because if you were trying to do marketing for that team, then the coaches of that team did a terrible disservice to everyone in the squad. Because what they did was made the jungler and mid laner look like a fucking moron, like for the first year or so, by making them play stuff that they weren't that great on, and they were doing it in like the spotlight of the hardest league in the world, and they're trying to play things that they're not that good on. Meanwhile, if that had been a Western team and they'd have had those players, Lee and fucking Kuro, what you would see was they would look way better, because what they would have done was they would have hidden all their weaknesses. They'd have never made them play any of these things, and they'd have actually just sort of compromised some of the other aspects of the team comp to make this player. I mean, I'll give you some examples just to trigger people, Phoenix, Keen, these sorts of people. You just never notice quite how like underwhelming these players were
and they'd look like potential stars because you'd never make them learn a certain style, or never make one person in the team give something up to give something or another,
And it's also like, sorry, go on.
Or you end up in a situation where you can only play Talon in the quarterfinal, Unicorns of Love.
Like, the thing is, I'm not trying to say that like Koreans don't have champion pool issues, because of course some teams do, but they're not so drastic that it actually affects the team too much. It'll be like 1 or 2 champion pool issues throughout the team that you can deal with in ban phase, as opposed to the West, where like Fnatic and Spring Split literally did not play any meta ADs. You never had to worry. Like, you just completely drafted a whole different strategy just for them, and those teams can win regionally, but I don't see a team like that ever winning Worlds. Meanwhile, like a team like us or G2 or TSM, the teams that try to play more standard, will either be good enough to win regionally by playing the fundamentals, and then we're either shit at Worlds or we perform. So it's like 2 different approaches, and maybe the Spring Split Fnatic style would do better at Worlds, and they'd look like the best Western team, while TSM drops out of groups. That doesn't necessarily mean that, in my opinion, that doesn't necessarily mean that Fnatic was the better Western team.
Sure. I mean, it's one tournament.
Yeah, for me, I respect teams that try to master the fundamentals so they can win the big tournament more than I admire the teams that play just to this style to see how far they can get. Okay.
What do you think about that, Kelsey?
I think that I agree with what he says, but it does downplay a little bit, just for, I guess, a casual audience, the fact that teams do still have styles, right? Specifically, like, you still do have things that you're very comfortable with, and I mean, I felt like, which we'll probably get into as we keep discussing, like, for example, it was very difficult for your team to adapt to playing without engaged supports.
Yeah.
So you did end up finding a way around that, and you went for something to do that ended up having certain counters and things of that nature. But definitely teams will have like sort of limitations, but it's more about, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're bad teams, because there isn't really a perfect team that doesn't have those anyway, or doesn't have a very defined specific way of playing. Like Longju Gaming is a very clear example as well that we've discussed a lot on this show.
Well, I mean, the problem obviously is that you can't really in League of Legends because of the way the game changes, and as a result, no one can preempt what's going to happen. Everyone's finding solutions in some sense and putting fires out and trying to build a better structure for next time. Okay, what were you going to say, Hussain?
I was going to say that, like, even within the system of like us having these engaged support compositions, if you actually watch the way we played the games in terms of, okay, we get this tower, this is how we reset, this is how we pressure the map, it wasn't different on engaged comms versus non-engaged supports. It was just on non-engaged supports, we were worse at a certain stage of the fundamentals, which is a lot different than playing off-meta champions and then not playing the fundamentals of League, like the actual game itself, correctly. Because I think even though we had different picks, those picks were tried by other teams in scrims. And they just didn't pull it out because either they weren't comfortable getting the early game advantages with it, or like they weren't comfortable with how much early game advantages they got with it, or they felt it was too risky for stage because teams played slower, which is fair. Okay. But even if we went against SKT and we played non-engaged supports, chances are that we would still get early game leads. Chances are that we would still, to a certain extent snowball the game very similarly, but then at the part where like you've got vision and you actually need to pressure an objective with either engagements or baiting them in, that is the part where we would misplay because we weren't comfortable with it. And it's not so much that we're relying on this to cover up or to not play the fundamentals, it's just there's a weakness in our fundamentals that we're covering up. And that's a different problem than other teams have that just have one unique style, but don't, like Unicorns, for example, I don't think historically has been a great team fundamentally.
No.
And they still have a very unique style to them. And that's very different than having a unique style with fundamentals.
Sure. Okay, so here's a question then, because what's actually surprised me about the tack that you've taken on this is that I assumed by the fact that you were like, I wouldn't say like mad triggered or anything, but you were like intrigued by the notion that I would suggest that TSM was a better team than Misfits. Admittedly, I do think that tweet was after just the group stage. Like I think it was only because obviously it was when TSM had just gone out. So obviously no one had seen the SK Telecom series at that point in time. And everyone just thought that you'd basically just found an opium den, apparently, where they were hosting the tournament. So everyone thought, well, fucking hell, he's celebrating a bit much, and you need to stay off Twitter when you're doing that, mate. So everyone didn't know that indeed Misfits would have a decent chance against SK Telecom. So within that context, the reason why I say I'm surprised with the tack that you've taken now is because you've, like, as I just said there, you kind of have outlined that, you know, doing well in one tournament doesn't mean you're a better team. Actually outplacing someone in a tournament where you never played each other doesn't mean you're a better team. You know, there's a lot when you have a very small sample size like that, it doesn't really mean a whole lot. It's one of the reasons why I actually realized, it was only about a year and a half ago, I realized that I will probably always be involved in League of Legends as long as it doesn't just like die out as a game to the extent it's super small. You know, I'm obviously not going to make any fucking content for people where it's like 10 hits or something. But one of the reasons why is because it's like I actually feel like I am fucking Morpheus going into the Matrix, and you're motherfuckers just in the Matrix. And you might think you're doing really well. Like Kelsey thinks she's like worked up to be like a fucking strong independent lawyer in like some fucking law firm, you know. Now she's like really going far with shit. But I'm just here to pull these motherfuckers out and be like, come to the real world. Like narratives are literally your world. You don't even know what a narrative is because you're like a fish in water. You just can't even see them. You eat, breathe, and sleep in narratives. And one of the reasons why that I'm getting to that is because when I think of all these other games I followed, and even other sports, except for the NFL, I can't think of any that has such an atrocious sample size and yet then has applied to it the most black and white hot take culture you could ever imagine. So people act right that when you go so when we talk about TSM at Worlds, for example, okay, here's a very, very small piece of context that you will never hear discussed in how TSM does at the 2 World Championships that they bombed out of as one of the top Western seeds, is the fact that when you play these tournaments, Season 6 Worlds, Season 7 Worlds, it goes like this. First of all, you play each of the teams on different days. Then you play them all on one day. Now, if anyone can't see how that might alter your results, and then going back and look, oh, wait a minute, that's weird, because TSM always does well in one section, and on the other section, they never quite have the same results. That's weird, because weren't all the other ones played on separate days, and wasn't this one played all on one day, all three apart? Like, no one ever even brings that up as a reason why, you know, asks, is there some flaw in how they adapt between games when they have a very short amount of time? Do they prepare in a special way where it's for one opponent? Is there some sort of a fatigue factor that they experience? But, you know, like, I don't have to know the answers to any of those questions, and those are worthwhile questions to ask when you're going to judge someone's entire year, because remember, that's what people do ultimately for the seasons, on how you did for those 4 different days, and then whether you played more on one day and one on the less. So the reason why to bring this full circle to get the question here is I thought you should, if I was coaching you here, I'd say, right, sidebar, I need to have counsel with my client here. He's like, what the fuck are you doing out there? Listen, you realize, motherfucker, your team was good for like 4 days in the whole year. Stick to the script. It's the results that matter. The World Championship vindicates this. And you know what? Let's build it in fact. The fact that Fnatic later on got their shit together makes it even better that we beat them when they clearly didn't know what the fuck they were doing and probably shouldn't even have made Worlds. But what was probably thinking, Koreans, no one even knows who those guys are. And plus, they're not even good. Well, one of them's sort of good, but it's the support. You can't really rank those. And, you know, again, I did like a sidebar with Polly there within the sidebar. So now that we come back out of that, that means essentially you are arguing the position, right, Hussain, that Misfits on some fundamental level is just a better team than all these other Western teams, and whether or not the results had shown it or not, right?
After a certain point in the year, I think we're better than every Western team fundamentally, except for G2.
Okay. He had to put the caveat in, didn't he? He had to pop that little caveat on there.
G2 and us is interesting because I think in some ways we're better, and I don't think they're better than us. I think we're even.
Okay.
Because I think our early game, and by extent our snowballing of the early game, was better than theirs, but they were a lot better than us at the time at playing from behind, and it's not like the early game was weak. It's just that ours was better, and we were, in my opinion, much faster at snowballing games.
They also had some better players, right?
Yes.
That helps. That will help, believe it or not. I mean, I know TSM obviously the good counter to that. Like, you know, they just get even good, better players, but do worse. TSM, that could be sort of like the Nike just do it for TSM. Get better players, do even worse.
The thing with the TSM tweet was that I was just curious what time frame you were referring to, because if it's for the year, then I agree, because they've won both splits. But I think gameplay-wise, our performance in playoffs was a lot better than their performance in their playoffs, even though they won NA, because I think the quality of our games were a lot better than theirs.
You can even point to specific things that by the time you get to Worlds, Misfits were just doing better habitually in game.
I think
things
just in playoffs, I think we were a lot better with tempo and resetting, and I think we were better at early game, and we were better at vision as well.
Yeah,
the only thing I think TSM might have been better than us at was possibly team fighting from behind, because that was one of our weaknesses. But I think we did almost everything macro even or better than them.
I think, I guess specifically what I would point to is what you did with resets. I think TSM, that's something that has really cost them in their early games. It's just like they don't really see that when they come back on the map that they have a window where they can increase their control. Sometimes they just say, oh, okay, we backed, now we're going to farm a camp or something like this. Whereas I felt like by the time Worlds comes around, Misfits was very good at, for example, just like making sure the first thing you do is get control of the river and then go forwards and things like this. So I think that, to me, that was a very clear difference between how Misfits was approaching the game and how their lanes and their jungle in particular worked much better together than most of the Western teams. I think probably all of the Western teams of the tournament. So
I think also, like, if you look at most Korean teams, and surprisingly some LPL teams at Worlds, and then us and G2, we almost never just stuck around, just watching someone take our tower, watching our minions die while we're zoned off, without the option to push back right away. TSM would just try to get an XP range. Like, it's such a, in my eyes, at a tournament like that was like one of the more basic things about tempo and resetting, which they were making mistakes on at the group stage. And I can't speak to their scrim because we never scrimmed them, so I don't know how well they were doing in scrims against teams. But on stage, a lot of basic stuff that we understood about resetting, they didn't seem to. And I think that was kind of true for playoffs as well. It's just, personally, I don't think the teams that had to go through playoffs were as good as what we had to face outside of Unicorns.
Well, okay, let me give you some context then. Obviously, I don't want to draw this too much away from Misfits, because I want to tie everything back into Misfits or contrast it with Misfits, because it just keeps a better thread going through the conversation. But I actually do think that one of the big problems with how everyone views these two TSM squads, obviously it was the same lineup, but to me they're different squads because you had the different storyline of how the year played out, and obviously actually even slightly different coaching staff and other components like that. And you even have to add in that for the Season 7 team of a TSM, it's not like they had the fucking Men in Black guy come and reset them after the last Worlds. That the impact of the last Worlds is present upon them. Like, I've always felt this from studying a lot of games, that one of the reasons why you get these ridiculous scenarios where, for example, one team always beats another team is because eventually it actually just gets completely in the head of the team that keeps losing. That, like, it's almost like they hyper scrutinize what they're doing in a way where they constantly think to themselves, it's like second guessing yourself, basically. You think, well, that didn't work last time. Oh, this is going wrong. And so you just overcorrect constantly. And in that scenario, it's not actually going to help you. You probably just was a tiny tweak away from doing well. Or in fact, in some of the instances, if I was some sort of psychology coach, I would actually tell some of them, we don't even know if that we lost that game because we did the wrong thing. Let's just try it again. Let's just do it all over again. Let's see how it goes. Like, I would try that approach now. So one of the problems I have with TSM at Worlds, and this will sound a bit weird, because I guess the only contrast could be against G2. Now, I admit G2 had a different group this time, so G2, I can kind of forgive them for this one, but they bombed enough at like MSI, etc. also, that I think you can take G2 into the same group a little bit, which is in G2's case, I think it's just a very, very simple version of the fact that they were so good in Europe, and then they had high expectations, and then they started to flop, and for me, it's just the aspect of, it was just in their own heads at that point in time, and so they always would lose the big key game, and then the game, you notice every time they were like already in a scenario where they probably couldn't make it anymore in one of these international scenarios, then they'd start to look promising and start to look good, like, oh, look what we could have done, oh, bloody hell, that last game, because the pressure had been relieved, For me, TSM is probably the team that has to be viewed in isolation the most of any Western team, because first of all, they won all the splits. Then they have someone in their owner who obviously plays a massive role in their org, who constantly stresses the idea that, like, if you lose today, you must win tomorrow. It's never like, well, we lost today, here's the reasons why, you know what, to fix these fundamentally might take a few more time. And it's like, no, whatever you have to do to make tomorrow the win, And so I could imagine, I mean, this is an abstract thing to say, but in a world where some coach could say to Reginald, well, I could improve the team long term, but that'd take me a couple of weeks, I might lose a few games. Or I could apply this like really quick band-aid fix tomorrow and you could maybe win tomorrow's game. I feel like in this obviously ridiculous dichotomy I've set up there, to me, Reginald always took the latter option, was like, just put the band-aid on, like, I need to win this next match, And that really kind of plays out as to why, very few teams have ever spent season on season as much money and gotten as little at the World Championship as this team has. Then you add in, as a final factor, the fact that I actually think that they've never looked into what happens to their teams at the World Championship. And what I mean by that is, like, literally, this will sound like a very weird point, but any owner who's watching this right now, actually try this, because if you're going to have a team for years and years and you're going to try and go to 5 more League of Legends World Championship, this could actually completely save your ass when it comes to coaches. What you do is, how you have a reality TV show, film your team doing all the stuff and then you put out the cool episodes, right? Just take all the footage that he doesn't put in the episodes, all the stuff when they're sat around and then when the team's having a big discussion, but most of it's not interesting or it's too gameplay specific, and you cut it out. Take all that stuff where the team is like having the coach tell them what was going wrong and having discussions, and just look at how different the communication is at Worlds when you're under pressure, when you've had the really big problem and the guy has to make that big fix. Look how different his communication is. Not what he's saying, but the way he's saying it and the way he approaches the problems and how they all discuss it. And then look at how you discuss things in the regular season of your domestic region. And I would just guarantee, without knowing this, that it's night and day, and that people are in some mad pressure cooker scenario when they're in TSM, where all of these factors, which you'll notice are nearly all psychological factors, and almost none of these are gameplay related, because I don't somehow imagine that every split of LCS, TSM just magically trips over and gets to the final or wins, but then gets to international competitions and can't learn and can't adapt and is completely locked off, because I've seen that in so many sports. It's called paralysis by analysis. Like, you cannot think in the moment because you have pressurized yourself so much that you can't improve and learn the way you normally do. You've like locked off all of the latent powers you would have to improve as a person. What do you think?
I think there's some truth to it. There's also, like, it's difficult to talk about TSM in terms of like whether these problems will continue on for the next roster, because I actually think Mithy fixes a lot of the issues that TSM have had. Both in terms, like,
by the way, let me just quickly say that that's also another factor, just as a final point to add as well, is that they never got a reset because they went back to the same lineup again. So in some senses, you have to have fixed all the problems. You can't just then roll it and go, just try the whole thing over again. They obviously didn't address them. They really thought to themselves, let's just hope season 6 was, it just went wrong on that one day, and then let's hope it works out. If anything, they used my logic in a sense. Like
the thing is that I actually think the reason G2 bombed this year versus their previous international tournaments is completely different. I kind of agree with what they've said, just based on their games at groups. I don't think they played poorly. I don't think they played scared at groups or anything like that. I think they were just against better teams for that day in RNG and Samsung. And like, G2 can talk about, whether they would have done better in a best of 5 or not. To me, that doesn't really matter. But if you look at G2's performance at Worlds versus TSM performance at Worlds, I think G2 just looked a lot better and had a harder group, where TSM just looked completely lost.
Yes.
And so I think TSM has that issue with mindset, and possibly an organizational issue, where either they think they have something really good going and they think they can perform better and they'll stick with it and not be risky enough in improvements, or they'll have what they had this year and then they'll try a full reset. But the thing is that, like, at some point they have to understand that, like, they can keep trying to do this, where every single year they go for the NALCS win into international tournament. And if they ever manage that, great. But to me, it still seems like TSM struggling to find a core. They have Bjergsen, and sure, they have some aspects of the playstyle that carry through, but a core roster needs to have 3 players that have similar values, that have a certain playstyle that sticks together year to year, and then you improve on other parts. And I don't think TSM has that outside of Bjergsen. Like, I don't think TSM's had a single member that you can say has similar values to Bjergsen and that can carry over year to year. So even a reset for them is difficult, because once they reset like they have this year, they essentially need to start from scratch again. Or they have last year, where they, in my opinion, weren't aggressive enough in how to fix what they had in 2016. So in both sides of the coin, I think TSM kind of, in some ways, has dropped the ball.
Well, okay, let me just make one final little point on that, because I don't have that much more on this issue anyway, so I'll throw it to Kelsey after. But actually, on that line as well, I even think if you just look at the actual in-game decisions they made at both worlds, when they got to the second week, when obviously everything went bad both times in similar fashion, you look at their team, and the reason why people were so exasperated with the drafts, which admittedly, yeah, people always just go ridiculous over any loss that's a draft, but I actually think one thing that I will agree with fans on in both Season 6 worlds and Season 7 worlds for TSM is that you looked at some of the champions they picked and you were like, you only had one way to win with these comps. And then secondly, it looks as though you just said, right, well, we've made a misread of the meta and we haven't really necessarily adapted. So fuck it. Everyone just go to something that they feel comfortable playing, possibly the last game of your life ever on, and just, live without worries, guys. Where it's like, if you actually really thought you were a good coach and that you had a good team, it was versatile and had all these really good players on, you'd go, well, I'm not just going to give up because I failed the first time. Let's find the correct solution. Let's apply it. And that will win the game for us. It's not about winning this game. It's about if we have improved as a team, the byproduct is we will win the game. That's, to me, it's like it even shows a difference in philosophy in that sense, because I feel like they almost did. It almost feels like it was just like the last day in the bunker in that fucking room before they went out, and they were like, right, smoke them if you've got them, and then pick whatever the fuck you want to go down on and have everyone ream your ass out. And so Holzer, obviously being a true legend, was just like, give me Jace. I will always take the Jace. That's like being the guy who just wants a quick death. You just like, give me the cyanide pill. I don't want the slow fucking wasting away. So anyway, I might have just typed that up too much. Kelsey, come on, give me some straight fire analysis.
Yeah, I think the thing with TSM though is I can't attribute too much of it to mental. Maybe their lack of improvement over time is that, but a lot of the problems that they've had in World Championship games have been consistent with the problems that they've had domestically. And I think they have really, really tried to develop fundamentals. And like the Jays pick, for example, just if you watch their red side drafts, they have a very specific formula for red side drafts where they almost always last pick top and they try to counter pick top. So they try to play to top side on red side, try to play to bot side on blue side. It's pretty consistent, and they just get fixed in this one idea of playing, and maybe they just aren't challenged in it enough to kind of develop it further, but they kind of tunnel in on this, and they had the same problems that they've always had with resets, and they've had the same problems that they've had with, people meme Svenskeren for getting caught in like that specific area by Raptor several times, but I went back and I watched games where they had Thorin, games where they had Amazing, and those guys were getting caught in the same spot too in 2014, 2015. Okay. So I just think that,
let me ask you this then, Kelsey. Isn't that actually sort of playing into that narrative then, that they just go with whatever, like, in the very short term seems to work in some sense? They go for comfort, essentially, over the discomfort of growth or trying to do something else? Because here's the thing, like, especially the modern lineup that they had, the problem with the old lineup is I actually don't blame them as much when they had like Santorin and they had some of that like Wild Turtle, because these are fairly limited players. But you look in the modern lineup, and one of the reasons why I get mad triggered, obviously, and then actually bizarrely toxicity does apply to me, because when I get triggered, then I set about triggering everyone else in the world, don't I? So in a way, I guess the Riot toxicity model doesn't make any sense in a fucking video game. People play for fun, but in the real life social media adventures of partially ginger journalists from the northeast of England, probably just only one due to corruption, nepotism, and sexism inherent in the industry, and a lack of critical theory applied. Aside from that, yeah, it does apply. So, because here's the problem: is every single split, every single year, people tell us that TSM has all these amazing players and that they're 1 to 5 they're so good and they've got the 3 best carries and all that. In their world where that was true, they should have all the answers. They've got the ultimate toolkit from which to pick the new tool to apply and win the game.
I would say my objection to this idea that they are tunneling, I guess, habitually or just out of fear or just afraid to change is I don't agree with that, because I feel like they're trying to play the way they think the meta is. They're trying to play like the way that Hussain described earlier, where you have an idea of what the meta should be. You have an idea of, we're going to change this to match like these specific champ picks, and we're going to try to have really good fundamentals. It's just, for whatever reason, I don't think that they really know how to develop it behind beyond a narrow view of what the fundamentals are. And hopefully this year that changes when they've changed out some of the people who've been there for a while.
Let me just give you a follow-up for that. Oh, sorry.
I actually think like the reason 2018 TSM is so exciting is because, so with Double Lift, when they brought in Double Lift, they had two potential players that could form a core roster. Yes. And if the two worked well together, then you would start having a team identity or an org identity that you could build around. Like, for example, SKT has changed the top laner and jungle quite often at this point, even if there are few subs. But the way SKT plays is very similar year to year.
Yes.
And I think if TSM can find that, it'd be good. But the thing is, like, you need 3 out of 5 players, in my opinion, like a majority roster that works well together, is top tier, and understands like the style that they're playing, but is also varied enough to build these fundamentals past just narrow view. And I don't think Double F and Bjergsen necessarily had that. Where Sven and Mithi and Bjergsen together is fantastic because you have a core roster finally in TSM. And within that core roster, like I think
it's not Sven Skaren though, is it? It's like Mike.
Oh, sorry.
Sven.
No, sorry, Sven.
Oh, Sven, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry about that. So Sven, Mithi, and Bjergsen is a strong core for TSM. That
sure.
With Sven and Mithi having like 2 years of EU LCS worth of macro versus whatever Bjergsen's been going through. So you've got a different take on fundamentals as well now. So this is the most exciting roster TSM has had, not just because they got the best players for the best 2 pickups, but rather because they have a core that has different fundamentals that they can teach each other. And Mithi's excellent at teaching a team. And
sure.
This is probably the first time TSM's had that in years, where you can look at a core, at 3 out of 5 players on TSM and say, this is, at the world's level, a fantastic core.
Okay, right, let's bring it back to Misfits then. We went too deep on the TSM hole there. See, ironically, this is actually one of the few episodes where everyone's like, you just talk about bloody TSM 90% of the time. I don't, you're just a TSM fan, therefore for you, you're just walking around like, everyone's got a red card just because I've got a red card. It's like, you're not having, you should notice the red cards, you fucking moron. Look on the street. So anyway, what I want to know is this then. So, Kelsey, when you did your analysis of Worlds, as I said, you had that storyline that was like a little bit similar to the Samsung one there. But another one that I know you were very skeptical about, right, was this notion that it was like, you know what, that fucking Ignar he is an iconoclast. He is a revolutionary. He's not merely a reactionary, you know. He is a revolutionary. He has figured out a different way to play the game so that, you know what, his team doesn't lose because they don't have Korean or Asian bot lanes and Ardent Sensor, you know. He's found another path. Whereas actually, I get the feeling that your sense was, no, he literally is a reactionary, which is that he could only do these things in response to that. He couldn't have just played all the Ardent Sensor champs and then done a half decent enough job. He had to do this. This was his only strength. He's lucky that he essentially got pushed into a corner when he can only fight from a corner in this analogy. And that ended up working out in his favor. And then he even got the right opponents, presumably, to be able to make that work as well. Because, for example, I'd much rather be facing the SK Telecom bot lane at this Worlds and having to pick Blitzcrank than playing against the RNG bot lane at this Worlds and having to play Blitzcrank. You know, I feel as though one is primed for potential success. The other one is actually an even worse version of that TSM one of like, play your comfort champions and get your shit pushed in. So Kelsey, is this in line with what you were thinking? Like, it wasn't necessarily that, like, put it this way, if the meta had been different, this wouldn't have worked, right?
I think there are a couple of caveats to that point. One is that a lot of people, when I make this point, people are saying that, like, I'm saying Ignar literally can't play this champions. I think it's more that Misfits is kind of reliant on having Ignar play these kinds of champions. I do think Ignar's Janna games were not as overwhelming, like the way he positioned in terms of using his ult sometimes was lackluster. Sometimes his tornadoes weren't that good, but I think overall, like, his Janna was fine. It was more the way that in mid game, I guess, partly when Misfits went to get vision, they didn't seem as able to challenge vision on, like, the side of the map where the priority objective was. Like, for example, I think there was a WE game where after they come back and he's playing Janna and he's putting wards on bottom side when Dragon isn't spawning for a couple of minutes, and everyone else is like, well, we're too scared to go to Baron because we don't have a support that can challenge this. They had Alfari in a position throughout the year where he was constantly with the team when they were getting vision, and then they tried to move away from that. And I think, like, having to play some of these squishier supports hurt them a little bit in making that a consistent thing as well. So I think for me that it was more this aspect of the team. Also, when you get to that point where you want to play against SK Telecom and you want to snowball really hard on their bottom lane, I do think that it is a good approach to take. Like you said, now you understand, like, I remember you were memeing Hussain ridiculously when he said that he wanted to play SKT and not like some of the other first
I wasn't
teams.
actually memeing, by the way. I legitimately disrespected him. Like, I just think it was totally, utterly inane thing to say. So I won't hide behind memes like all the rest of you guys do when you flame each other on Twitter. I legit just thought the guy was out of his fucking mind.
I think they were the best matchup for us of the 4 options, of the 3 options.
So that was my primary criticism of it, because I felt like,
okay,
and eventually SKT's drafts, they had very good answers to what Misfits were trying to do as well in the last 2 games. I think the game 4 draft in particular was really good with like the Trundle and the Braum, which you ended up having to ban in game 5. And just having that into Sejuani, Cho'Gath, like just having all these options for, and then Jarvan to knock out the Karma Sivir stuff. So like all of that stuff was just really well done. So I think to a point there were limitations to the style of play that didn't necessarily allow Misfits to succeed as well as they could have if they had been able to figure out like this element of fundamentals in terms of incorporating more ardent sensor supports in the way they get vision or in their team fights, because I think there were some issues with team fights, especially against like WE, and the way that WE kind of led you up mid lane for fights in several instances. So for me, I think it was more just the way the team worked instead of criticizing Ignar specifically, I guess.
I can agree with that, because like from the inside, Ignar definitely prefers the engage supports, but the main reason was his communication when playing these engage supports for engaging was really good. It was maybe it's because of the language barrier that initially existed when he first came to Europe, but by the time we were in Summer Split and the second half of Spring Split, he would speak in really short sentences. He would be very aggressive. And so it was very, like, if you heard Ignar say, watch me, all 5 players are on the same page immediately. So he was our best engager just vocally as well. And when we moved away from engage supports into range supports, and we had this issue with Zyra Karma meta way back when as well, it would be on Alphari or Maxlor, or sometimes Hansama on engage ADs to make these calls. And Hans had gotten pretty good at it because we played nothing but engage ADs for a while. But it took a while for Max or Alphari, just us as a team, to get the same communication, because the rest of the team was trying to find the perfect way to communicate this, while Ignar had this natural affinity for how to communicate engages, how to position for engages and how to communicate them. Also, the support position makes it much easier to engage as well compared to jungle and top, so that played a factor. But at Worlds, I don't think we were reliant on the comp we pulled against SKT. The reason we pulled that comp out is because the picks they were playing in bot lane allowed us to. And in group stage, our best games were on standard comps. We tried that comp against TSM, and it was a good game, but it's one of those comps where if you make one mistake, the game's over. And we weren't good enough to do it then, but we were really good at standard comps. Like us making it out of group stage was on standard comps. And the 2 times we played TSM, for example, we just straight up outplayed them on the map with range support. So we had gotten pretty good at having Max or Alphari or Hans engaging by Worlds, but it was a huge issue for most of the year. And with that roster, we would always be a lot more comfortable with Ignorant support on engage, but I don't think we were necessarily as bad as people might think by the time we got to Worlds.
Sure.
Okay.
It's a different conversation whether we could take on RNG or like other teams in quarterfinals playing standard, but if we did play RNG, for example, if they were playing the same picks that SKT was playing, we would have probably pulled out the same comp, because it wasn't us trying to cover up our weaknesses. That was like what's the word I'm looking for? That was like a secondary factor that happened to be there, but the main reason was because those are the picks that this punishes. Those are the only picks you can play this into. And we found that out in scrims, and so did a few other teams.
Okay, so I've got a question for you then. Like, when I said before, all the experts on the show, no one had Misfits coming out. Even like other European players weren't like, oh, you got to watch for them. They're secretly the best European team. Not only that, But first of all, you never got any, as far as I saw, unless I missed something. Correct me if I'm wrong, Kelsey. I never saw any of the traditional pre-Worlds hype where the Koreans all get together, have like a bunch of like, you know, seasonal drinks, you know. One of them has a little bit too much soju and then they go, let's troll the West and do interviews in which we all say that like one of the teams is really good and that in scrims we think they're going to be sick just to fuck with everyone. Like obviously we don't really believe that. Because here's the thing, I only care about what Koreans say before World starts. Because if they actually say in scrims, oh, in scrims this team was pretty good, I think there's at least some basis. Like on the very most basic level, that team probably had a couple of good games, had a few good matches against them, or one player maybe stood out on a certain meta pick. But when after a team does well, the Koreans, by the way, they're smart as fuck in this sense. This is how a culture works over there, by the way. It's supposed to be homogenous. So what happens is, when a team does well, yeah, now everyone's going to say, now Coma's going to be like, I always thought Misfits was a good team, and the way they've improved is so excellent. You know, they know how to say what people want to hear. The problem is, if Coma didn't say that before, and if no team from scrims was like, oh, this team's pretty good, and nobody from their region was like, oh, you got to watch out for them, I start to wonder if any of these people actually thought the team was good. So, but from the outside, Hussain, your team was either some mad black box where you were working on shit that no one knew about, or you tried all this stuff, you played standard, you played these picks in scrims, and in scrims, there's no big deal. Everyone just thought you were an all right team. What would your response be?
Well, for one, we didn't scrim that many Korean teams because it's hard to get Korean scrims unless you're TSM. Or now
Shots
G2.
fired.
So,
okay. Well, I mean, obviously,
actually, I'm not even sure how many scrims TSM got from Korean teams this year.
You think there wasn't many?
I don't think so. I think like they definitely got the most out of the Western teams. I assume them in G2, but I think in previous years, like for example the Samsung White era, I think during that era TSM probably got a lot more Korean scrims.
You know, by the way, that's also something I would investigate if I was like a big Western owner. Because again, you notice if you're a Western owner, you can't really do like the day-to-day stuff of the game because you can't really know what's going on there and change it anyway. It wouldn't apply next year. But another thing I would do is I would actually get together with other Western owners and be like, let's just trade notes on how Koreans scrim against us. Because I've also always had the theory that the only reason Koreans ever broke down and started actually properly scrimming teams at Worlds when they do the Korean boot camp is because they actually realized, oh, wait a minute, since these people aren't that great at practicing, actually when we practice them we just get an even bigger edge because we just see all the shit they do and how they play, and then what we do is we half troll, and then when we play the real game they're like, what the fuck, they didn't do that, and then we're like, haha, thanks for showing us. Because I know that the Koreans used to have the opposite approach. Like famously, this applied in StarCraft as well, they used to think the opposite, which is actually try and play the other guy as little as possible, because if you're better than him, why give him any insight into how you play? But obviously the secret there is, if you realize that essentially the guy has some sort of like learning disability in the context of this analogy, then you playing him all day long, which helps you even more. So that's something I'm interested in. I'm shocked that in that sense that they don't scrim that much then.
It's like so we're not that well known. We didn't have a great regular split. I think unless we won EULCS, we probably wouldn't have gotten that many Korean scrims no matter what. And even if we won, like the bigger names, the orgs and management people that Koreans know generally have like a better favor in terms of getting Korean scrims as well. So I assume like next year it probably changes when we make Worlds, and it'll probably get better year to year. Okay. But it was our first year. I think Splice had the same issues as well last year with scrims. But our scrim results have never, like even for playoffs, our scrim results are never fantastic because more often than not in scrims, like either certain blocks will just be to test matchups. So it doesn't matter if, like, a lot of teams say that they don't care about winning or losing. It's kind of a meme at this point, but the day before 2 days before SKT, we lost like almost all of our scrims. It's not uncommon for us to lose scrims. It's just that when we finally sit down to prep for drafts, we have a really good understanding of what matchups work together or what champions have good synergy or like exactly how we want to draft. And as long as the players are learning the game well, then if they're given good positions and good champions, they'll perform with it. That's at least that's the hope with how we try to practice. So
Kelsey's been forcing a disproportionate amount of oxygen in her lungs repeatedly, so I believe she has something to say.
Oh yeah, I know. I'm getting subtly less subtle. Okay, so first, I would say, do you think that Because I've actually heard a lot of European teams are just surprised that you did so well in playoffs because of, they said that, okay, Splice was better in scrims, or these other teams were better in scrims just very blatantly. So do you think that your approach to scrims, I guess, is more unique in Europe in terms of not necessarily trying to win them as much? And because you did say it is almost a joke at this point where people will say that they don't care about scrims, but I actually find that a lot of teams do. And then the other question I have is, I guess, back to the previous conversation, sorry to sidebar, but you said that you picked these picks specifically into some of the picks that SKT were playing, but as the draft went on, you were picking like these supports more blind. So was it just something where you felt comfortable and good about it, or like what kind of is the psychology of that at that point?
On the scrim thing, I don't know if we're unique about it, because we also had a lot more to learn, and therefore like we were a lot further behind than say G2. So if we're scrimming them and we're losing a lot, it's because they have a lot more fundamentals down than we do. So we have a lot more to learn from these scrims. So it's not like we're losing because we're actually better, but we can't show it. It's just we're losing because our drafts aren't as good as they will be on stage, and our fundamentals aren't as good. But we do learn fundamentals pretty fast. And so if our fundamentals are improving in scrim and our drafts aren't, that's not an issue. If our fundamentals aren't improving in scrims and we draft the way we do, it won't matter on stage. We're still going to lose. So maybe that part is unique. I'm not sure. But on the SKT thing, we started doing it blind because I think it was game 4 that we did it blind. Mm-hmm. It was mostly because we kind of suspected they would go the same route of playing melee versus melee. So at that point, it was less about countering using our melee support pick to counter what they picked, but more so about getting the strongest melee. We were kind of right that they would take that gamble, but we underrated how practiced they would be with it. I also know that there were other teams that were trying to learn how to play melee supports within the meta. Mm-hmm. We just had more success with it because our early game was one of the better ones at Worlds. So I don't know how much SKT got to practice against melee picks, but we took a gamble and we kind of lost on that one.
Because here's the question along those lines then, is I heard a lot of people who were experts, even after these results of getting to game 5 against SK Telecom, who, funnily enough, I guess it ties into what you were saying about the fact that you didn't scrim against Koreans much. They told me, first of all, Misfits didn't have any Koreans in their group. Secondly, when they had to play some Koreans, they played the most vulnerable Korean team, and then they actually happened to have within their team answers and counters to actually some of the biggest flaws of the Korean team that they played. So they almost had a perfect storm. Meanwhile, this is just what people told me, they thought that if you had played loads of Koreans in scrims and had Koreans in your group, then this would have all been figured out. This solution wouldn't have worked.
Maybe if we did it during the boot camp, the Korean boot camp, but we did play this style against, I don't remember which Korean team it was, but we did play it before SKT, and they struggled against it too. I think it might have been Samsung, I don't remember. But it's either, I don't remember, but I know we did play it against Korean teams before SKT, and they struggled against it as well, quite a bit. So across multiple days, because we got the further you go in the tournament, the less scrim partners you have, the more you get to scrim Korean teams as well. So they struggled to figure it out as well, outside of just banning it. So I don't know if necessarily we would have stopped playing our picks. And of course, if we scrim Koreans a lot and they figured out how to beat our picks, and we would probably just stop playing them, or we'd pull it out, in a one-off game where the circumstances made it good.
Okay.
Because the only reason for SKT was that the circumstances were good. It wasn't so much that it's the best way to beat their bot lane. It just so happened that the bot lane was vulnerable and they were playing the picks that made it possible.
Okay. Because actually, I've remembered some of the context to put onto the TSM comments since you asked about that. So, because believe it or not, actually, in fact, I went back and looked up the tweet. Believe it or not, Hussain's approach, and this is obviously, and again, a revolutionary, he's in many ways the Ignar of replying to me on Twitter, right? What he did was he didn't just take everything as if it was a literal statement and then get personally offended on the basis that I don't think that someone he knows is as good as he thinks. What he did was just reply something along the lines of like he wanted to know what I thought or know more of my thoughts and have a discussion about it, so, kind of changing the radical metagame of the West in many ways there, Usually the approach is just to get butthurt and say that the other person's wrong and then never explain your positions. Because actually part of the context as to why I said, obviously TSM is a better team than Misfits, right? First of all, there's a little bit of vagary about that. Like part of it is, I think it has better players. And I think that if you played the tournament another month later or a month before, I would definitely put my money heavily on TSM to do better. But another piece of context to that is that in a weird way, I actually think that if you were to rank each team about how much they got out of each player in their team and how much they got out of their potential as an overall squad and then their practice and all right, I would rank the Misfits team very highly, actually. I would give them very high marks, probably got the most out of the squad they had, figured out probably generally the best approach to do things, generally probably got a lot out of practice and then mostly got a lot of performance in the actual game. I wouldn't really say there's very many underwhelming parts there. Whereas I actually think if I was to score TSM out of the Western teams, I would actually put them as the worst of all the Western teams in these exact respects. Fairly poor performance on stage, seemed like the practice hurt them more than it helped them, actually seemed to even take approaches to playing the game that weren't even very good for the composition of players or champions they had at certain times. So I actually think, in a weird way, the fact that TSM managed to get a win against every opponent in the group, playing even in those wins, not ideally, shows that, yes, I guess in a sense I'm saying TSM wasn't the better team than Misfits, because in that sense, in terms of performing and winning games at Worlds, Misfits beats them. But I actually think that, if anything, TSM sort of failed in spite of their strengths, if that makes any sense. It doesn't really make sense, because I don't know how you can run a team like that, but that's just how they run things. Because put it this way, one of the problems here, Hussain, is that I notice within any discussion of how well Misfits did, it's always like, oh, but you remember when they beat TSM? TSM, yeah, they're good. Yeah, they beat TSM. And then SK Telecom, yeah, Faker, that guy that Fion says every year, single-handedly won the World Championship, just a joke, that's not real, obviously. They did so well against them. Everyone just everyone passes over. I don't know if you're not aware of this, but there was a Chinese team in your group, and they weren't in any way the best team at the tournament. In fact, probably weren't even top 4. And then, you know what? They weren't even the best Chinese team, and they didn't even play that well around the global meta at Worlds. In fact, they tended to just do whatever the fuck they wanted as within their team and what they could. It was that they kind of were the other end of the equation. The strong do what they can, what they will, and the weak suffer what they must. They just suffered what they must. It happened that they got them top 4. Because they played Cloud9. But you guys lost to that team every time. So how does a team like TSM, these dullards, these idiots who can't, improve in scrims, who just don't understand, even in an ALCS, they've got all these weaknesses, how are they just tripping over and scoring wins against WE? And you guys are like, shit, Chinese bot lanes, what are those all about? How do magnets work?
Well, against World Elite, so the first game at Worlds was against World Elite, and I think regardless of what team we had played for that first game, we would have lost, because that was one of the best drafts we had in the tournament, in my opinion, in our team's opinion. But the draft in Europe, the way we'd have played the draft in Europe is we would have just waited it out, and we knew we would just win the game. So all we have to do is wait the game out. And World Elite in that draft has to snowball early game insanely hard under very specific conditions. It was a very TSM style comp that they have, where it's there's okay, 1 or 2 win conditions, and if you perform on those, you'll win the game. And if you don't, then the game's lost because you get outscaled. And at the same time, it's really hard to perform on those 1 or 2 win conditions.
Okay, but
World Elite did it.
Here comes the but. Yeah.
World Elite did that.
Right.
And it was an issue with proactivity that we had, because again, regionally, you can just wait the game out and win, and at Worlds you can't do that. If you don't actually try to make your own plays and try to take risks, then these teams will punish you, because World is probably the 5th best team at Worlds, right?
Sure.
I think only RNG can possibly claim being in a better position than them and all the LCK teams. So if you want to compete with that team, you have to make your own plays. The second time we played World Elite, I think like that was one of like the famous Misfits throws, the throws we had against most teams. So we showed a weakness, not just against World Elites, but against every other team. And at the same time, TSM got wins against those teams. But the reason I still think we were better than TSM is because, in my opinion, the way we lost against World Elite, as weird as it sounds, was still better than the way TSM won against World Elite. Because TSM winning World Elite is a lot more about how World Elite drafted and played the game, where us losing against World Elite was us not being good enough to close the game. And they're both weaknesses. It's just how you value each weakness. I don't know if that makes sense.
I think the first game of WE, a lot of that seems to be like the prevailing narrative about how the game played out, is that you guys weren't proactive enough and everything else. But that comp definitely should have worked. As
which teams?
Later on, Misfits, yeah. Yes. For late game, I think part of the problem is that like you had a very good approach starting out, where okay, we're just going to make sure we have vision of Condi around bot for most of the game, and then we're going to have like our bottom lane scale. And even though like theoretically Janna is better than Lulu, overall the composition was pretty sound. So I think it just, after a while, you stopped refreshing those words to an extent, and so that let W into the game. I wouldn't say that that's a lack of proactivity. It's just kind of a breakdown of what the plan was, it seemed to me.
Well, in that game, like in the sense of proactivity, is like when we realize that something is lost in most of our games, we give it up and we move on to the next play, and then on that next play, we're set up before the enemy team because we gave it up early and we're proactive in that moment. Against World Elite, they came for our bottom tower, and we did what I was criticizing TSM for doing earlier in the show, which is we just stood and watched it. And that's literally nothing like what Misfits ever does. It's the exact same. It's the exact thing we work towards avoiding. And in that sense, we weren't proactive, which is like, I don't think we had a lot of proactivity in the sense of us going and actively making plays, or us making a lot of ganks happen, or trying to find an early game lead. But for sure on the map, we could have been way more proactive than we were. But they started pressuring us, and we kind of just watched them pressure us, which is not like Misfits at all.
Yeah, I think to an extent that's true. I think they also just got better trades, and sometimes you went for trades that they were in better positions for. Like, for example, you did blue buff invade, I think, and Condi just backed, so he was strong on bottom, and then they had mid priority, so they could set up like a really, really good dive, and then they get dragged and a bunch of other stuff off of that. So I think some of it, like, that's kind of my quibble with the proactivity argument. So I wanted you to break that down a little bit, because I did feel like you had a plan and you were trying to execute on that plan. It just didn't work out well. It's
like the first step of our plan failed, and then from there the players just kind of stopped thinking about the next play or the next play. It's like more so like the narrative is proactivity in game, and to some extent that was an issue, but like my concern with proactivity was mostly in comms, because the way we communicate, the calls we make weren't being made at all. We were essentially sitting there and commenting on the game. Like all 5 players were commenting about what World Elite is doing, and that is what I meant by passivity.
Okay. Because another problem I have, is this. Whenever you have a team like Misfits, where the whole storyline is like, I mean, obviously, actually, the name fits the players that are in the team, because obviously they're not getting mad. I mean, even Power of Evil at the point in time that he joined this team was considered like damaged goods, didn't work out in Origin, etc. And sadly, too many people took the approach of like, that means he is a bad player, as opposed to, hasn't played with all these star players and in a terrible coaching scenario where no one's giving him any no one's throwing the guy like a thing, like a life preserver, they're just like, well, let him drown. I guess you're just not meant to live in water. In this kind of setting, you can teach someone to swim, believe it or not. So the difference is, when a team comes like that and it goes to Worlds, I get especially skeptical when it turns out that the jungler has one of the best performances of the team. Because for my money, someone who does really well as a jungler can, first of all, make players look a lot better. Not as in better than they are, but just look better relative to their how they would play with a totally different jungler. And then secondly, can absolutely help cover certain holes in a team and emphasize certain strengths. I mean, I realized, again, if TSM's watching, that's actually what a jungler in some ways is supposed to do. He can actually help service the team and make them better. In their world, they're like, well, here's 10 things that a jungler shouldn't do. That's like when you join TSM. Things you should not, the 10 commandments, thou shalt not ever go into this area without me saying, Lord Bjergsen. You know, in that scenario, I feel like TSM, again, that's part of why they have a limited ability to succeed, because they've gone with that approach, right? So when it comes to the players, have we been unfair about the players in Misfits? Hussain, are you actually one of these people who believes that shit that like Hansama was like one of the best Western AD carries the whole time, and then we just didn't see it until Worlds, you know, and then magically it turned out he was like, well, time to take off the Rock Lee weights now and learn how to trade in lane for this second set of group stage games. You know, some would say it felt like he overperformed in the last week and a half.
I think some players were unfairly judged and not others. So because you mentioned that you think TSM has better players earlier as well. I think 3 out of 5 of my players were better. I think Alfari is better than Hanser. I think Maxler is a lot better than Svenskeren. And then I think Ignar is better than Biofrost. So that leaves Bjergsen versus Power of Evil, Hans Sama versus Double Lift.
It's weird that, isn't it? Because what just happened there, Kelsey, was someone who's actually in a position of expertise in the West just actually said that Hanser isn't the best Western top laner. And what's bizarre about that is that opinion doesn't exist. I mean, I realize as long as people on the Riot broadcast agree with the fans, then apparently no one else's opinion exists. Because as I actually once said on Twitter, you wouldn't believe how many people behind the scenes don't think that any of these TSM lineups were the best 5 players for their region or role or possibility. But unfortunately, if you ever ask these people, why don't you say it publicly? They just go, well, what would it gain me to just get people to hate me? And the reality would be the same anyway. So I don't necessarily disagree with that. It's just interesting to hear someone else say it, because I've been told that I only say it based on some 4-year-old grudge with TSM, which doesn't really seem that relevant, really, you know. So Kelsey, what do you think of that? It's quite a provocative statement, right? He thinks that 2 of their players. Wait a minute, did you think 3 of them? Oh, it was on your side. Was the 3, right? He thinks 3 Misfits players are better than TSM players. Kelsey, respond.
As soon as he said that, I already knew like which ones in my head. You
can guess which ones it is. Let's not be fucking.
Yeah, silly, okay? I mean, it's true. It's like I agreed. I think Alfari was probably one of the least credited relative to his performance players on the team, because he was able to keep like the game, the way that you guys focused on the game or chose to end up playing the game was almost like an exaggeration of like what playing to bot is. It's like there was one point where I think Maxler was 2 levels behind, but you had 2 turrets or something, because he was just down there as Ivern the whole time. So yeah, but Alfari was like always even or better in lane. He was always like able to kind of get something back for if they screwed up their trade topside. So I think that like Alfari did insanely well at this tournament. I do think he outperformed Hanser. I also think I also am one of the weird heretics who put Ignar and Maxler on my EULCS award vote ballots. So I actually think those players were good in the EU context as well, even before they did well in playoffs. So, and I definitely think
that doesn't mean you think Ignar was better than Biofrost, though.
But I've never been really high on Biofrost anyway. So for me, it's like.
Here's the thing, I don't blame you there, because like as I always make this point, I always stress it again and again, because I've never heard an expert tell me any good reason otherwise. I think easily the hardest position in all the League of Legends to gauge is support, especially if you play with someone who is also considered one of the best AD carries in your region. Like, it completely throws off any ability to gauge how good the support is. That's why if you notice, the only supports where it seems to hold true that they are like gods, sort of, are the Swordite type guys where they don't ever have a good AD carry, but inexplicably they manage to do well anyway themselves. It's like you can only sort of show how good you are as a support when you have to rough it in a weird way, you know? If you actually play with a really good AD carry, no one ever knows if you're any good. Like, I know now, magically, everyone wants to tell me that, like, oh, Mako's gotten better and better. Well, how can that be? You told me he was the best in Season 5. Oh, no, this Ming guy is really good now. That's a surprise then. Does he play with Uzi by any chance? Like, you know, how many times am I supposed to eat this same fucking plate of horse shit and be like, the Belgian chocolate crafting of this horse shit has gotten incredible. No, it still tastes the same, doesn't it? So, It's okay. You've hedged your way out of that one with vagary.
I mean,
Moser in motion, we'll call
I can
that, where you just
specifically say, like, my issues with Biofrost is that I do think this might not even be a specific Biofrost thing, but the way that Doublelift and Biofrost trade in lane is often, like, really out of sync. Sometimes he'll be too far forward and he'll get poked down, or, like, he'll auto-attack when the enemy isn't, like, last hitting a minion or something like this, and so he opens himself up to trade really well in that sense. I think that, however, when you get down to almost the variety of different champions, like Ignar almost has an unfair advantage because he did play all of these supports that are easier to look good on, right? In terms of just like people say, oh man, that's sick hook, like he lands it every time. So in that sense, Ignar does have an unfair advantage there because he played much more of those champions than Biofrost did. But I just, in general, in terms of like those types of fundamentals, I do rate Ignar a little bit over Biofrost. And
well, that's also just the problem with TSM, isn't it? If you think about the way people frame the narrative, it's like if you are not Doublelift or Bjergsen, your job is to service Doublelift and Bjergsen. And then if TSM wins the game, everyone goes, wow, Bjergsen and Doublelift are really good. And then if you lose the game, everyone goes, why the fuck didn't you let Bjergsen and Doublelift win the game? You should service them better, you piece of shit. Like, you actually can never get some credit if you're the jungler or support player.
Yeah.
There's also the other thing where, like, the two players I didn't mention, which are Power of Evil and Hansama, like, going against TSM, like Kelsey said, it's true. On red side, they only draft to counterpick top lane. But we weren't sure if they would change that against us or not, because I'm always surprised when people think they can abuse Alfari. So going in, because we had two blue side games against them, going in, we knew that either Alfari or Power of Evil would have a winning matchup, and whichever one got it had to perform on it. So Alfari, I say, is better than Hanser because in 2 out of the 3 games he had losing matchups and he outperformed Hanser on both. And Power of Evil in 2 out of 3 games had really good matchups for himself, and he did his job. So it's tough to say whether Power of Evil was better than Bjergsen or not for those specific games. Obviously, Bjergsen, has a legacy behind him. But it's easy to say that Alfari, in my opinion, easy to say that Alfari was better than Hanser because he outperformed him in bad matchups in a tougher position than most top laners are put in.
Well, no, wait a second. Let's not make it too ridiculous with the caveats. Like, it doesn't matter what Bjergsen did in the rest of his life up until about season 7 summer, really. It doesn't matter if he was 10 times better. If he's a better player now, it's because he's a better player now. Like, yeah, maybe you can include some of the summer split. Sure, you want more data. But if people say Bjergsen's better, it's not like they're saying it just because he was amazing for many years and Power of Evil came up, right? So why did he kind of back off at the end there? It sounds like you're trying to imply that, like, Power of Evil is as good as Bjergsen.
No, I'm trying to say that, like, at Worlds, it's hard to say which one was better.
Right.
Because one had a winning matchup, one had a losing matchup, and Bjergsen played really well on the losing side of it, and Power of Evil played well on the... Like, they never actually interacted in these matchups. It's like our games against SKT. Faker and Power of Evil rarely ever actually interacted with each other because their roles in the games had nothing to do with each other. And it was very similar in our games against TSM. And it's very similar in a lot of Power of Evil games. It's just the way he plays. So he's a very weird player to judge. Like, over the year, Bjergsen was definitely the better player. At Worlds, it's hard to say just because he was never put, like, on red side, in my opinion, like, against a lot of teams, Bjergsen should have the counter pick. If counter picks exist for mid lane, and I think enough counter picks existed in mid lane where you could have played around mid. And TSM chose not to. And that's a criticism for TSM, which hurts Bjergsen's legacy quite often, I think. And it also makes it hard to judge how Bjergsen's performance.
Do you ever wonder? Okay, let me just get your take on this. Do you ever wonder how much in that scenario is actually like TSM and how much was Bjergsen? Like, maybe Bjergsen does that thing. I'll just bring this up because it's one of my lines of thinking that I actually do think applies to lots of people like him, which is that they get it in their heads that to demand what you want is selfish and that you should just sort of... Okay, I'll give you an analogy, okay? In Britain, since there is a culture going back a long time, especially obviously with the upper classes of like politeness, you know, and the rule of manners, etc. There's a famous joke scenario in England, which is that if there's one biscuit left, so a cookie for you Americans, if there's one cookie left and you want that cookie, what you're supposed to do is say to the other person, there's one cookie left, go on, you have it. And then what happens is politeness dictates they also must say the same thing to you. And so when they then say it to you, no, you go on and have it, you say, oh, thank you, and you have it, because the whole time you wanted it, but you didn't want to seem like you were being rude or demanding, right? The problem is, the reason why it's a joke is, the joke is that when you go, oh, you have it, and then they eat it, then you're fucking mad triggered because you just wanted it yourself, and you should have actually, if you wanted to use like a prisoner's dilemma scenario, if you definitely wanted to have the best chance of having the cookie, you should have just said, give me the cookie, I am hungry. Therefore, either if they don't want it, you get it, or if they just bow to your demands, you get it, right? In this scenario, I often wonder with someone like Doublelift, especially when he lives like 24/7 in the fishbowl of every fan being like, oh, by the tone that he responded to the coach in the reality series, is he an arrogant diva who was in fact a piece of shit? Axl Rose ruining the fucking Guns N' Roses. You know, they go to that level that unfortunately I feel like he has a mentality of like, he almost has to be told by the coach, oh, you're going to have all the picks here and you're going to be the player we're going to play on. Otherwise, he's like, oh, yeah, oh, well, I guess we're all even in this team and I'm not better than anyone else. Like, do you think that he himself understands what you're saying and would understand that he had to essentially take more control there? Do you think he plays into it? Like, oh, no, I'll play those things. That's fine. What would your speculation be as an outsider?
I think it's more so like the same thing as like what G2 and most top teams have, which is this is our understanding of the meta, so we'll play to it. Not every team agreed that mid lane counter picks were a big deal at the point because of art and meta.
So most people agreed. Too much.
Yeah, most people agreed that top lane counter pick was like a bigger deal, and so did we. We have like our mid laner is a lot different than other mid laners. For example, our Orianna priority is super high. We still feel comfortable playing LeBlanc against Orianna, which the LPL teams eventually showed. At least World Elite showed they played, but in scrims wasn't showing up at all. So we have certain picks that do well in matchups that TSM and other teams.
Okay.
Probably every top team wasn't practicing. So
well, let me ask you this then. Isn't that just because that is basically what Power of Evil's done his whole career? He picks the 3 champions he's playing, learns every matchup, learns like 3 different builds that no one else does that therefore maybe enable the matchup, and then as a result gets to pick these champions when the other team's like, well, why would they pick that? And therefore makes it work. Like, in a weird way, isn't that the same scenario as the Ignar situation before? Like, that's just an obvious strength that presents itself, right? Whereas Bjergsen maybe could do that, but why would he think to do that in his career, you know?
I think Power of Evil understands his strengths and he plays to it better than Bjergsen does, in the sense that he understands his constraints, his limitations, and also what he excels in more than anyone else.
Okay.
And he plays within that, and that's fine. That's a good way to go. Bjergsen has the ability to play anything and everything that he needs to.
Yes.
And also, with that said, they get practice against the top teams who all practice a very similar meta. So it's not so much that, you know, they can just say, okay, we'll counterpick mid against Misfits. It's more so, how do they figure out what those counterpicks will be against us, and that they should save mid lane pick for last pick, because in their scrims throughout bootcamp and for world scrims, that hasn't been the case. Mid lane counterpick hasn't mattered. So it's hard to figure out whether it'll pay off or not against us in a best of 1. And it's just safer to assume that we'll play the world's meta.
I think that's very true, because the way that the mid lane meta ended up developing this year is that you had like these wave clear mids that weren't actually, as he already said, interacting with each other that much. And so you would pick it like third pick. Sometimes you would do like 2 bans after you picked it third pick, and then to lessen the amount of counters that they could pick. But generally you would just end up with 2 wave clearing mids who tried to get priority in roam. Yeah. And so I think that, yeah, that was just the standard way to play. I think that I don't necessarily disagree with TSM's decision to stick to that. I just think that they weren't nearly as good at getting advantages when they played around topside and pressuring those advantages as they were when they played around bottom. So I think that ended up being a problem for them.
It's weird that you'd think they'd have actually watched this team called TSM play in NA and realised that they almost never did that. And so, you know, except for that free spring split that everyone else let them win for some inexplicable reason that almost looked like some sort of rigged fucking WWE match. But enough about that. Not bitter. Just moving on. Okay, I actually have a question along those lines, though, which is that... Oh, let me think. I think I've lost my point there. Where was I going with that? Well, what was the first thing you said before the second point there? Kelsey.
Oh, me? I said that it just ended up being, I don't necessarily disagree with TSM's decision, and that this was just the way that the meta was, and it made a lot of sense within the context of like that we're setting up draft this way. Just because of the way mid lane was played.
Like, first of all, there's two little things. Like, one thing, very, very small sidebar. I actually think that's one of the reasons why League is actually less compelling for a lot of fans now. It's not to do with that they're burned out on too many games and best of threes, or that, you know, best of three. Like, the worst logic I think I've ever heard is the idea that, like, but after the first game, you know, most fans want to tune out. They don't want to see game two. Like, what the fuck are you talking about? It doesn't even make any sense in any kind of context. Like, no. Like, first of all, if that was true, you could actually statistically prove it, and therefore we'd have a graph from Riot, and they'd be like, the reason we changed is because, look, the viewership goes down after game one. Like, guess what? If they don't show that and they have all the numbers, it ain't true. That's just a shit narrative, which is obviously the job of the show to kill. And then secondly, there's the fact that, so first of all, part of the reason I actually, an abstract, but I think nuanced reason as to why League is less compelling is because there is almost no 1v1 on the map at any point in time, except for very bizarre scenarios. Like, you actually can't get hyped to watch League the way that, like, C9 and TSM fans talk about Jensen and Bjergsen. They're not in a boxing match. They're not going head to head. Then no one's going to clap anyone in lane and style on the other guy. And by the way, anyone who thinks that Haunts is getting flame horizons against people when he gets 2 ganks and then the other guy's jungler fails a gank, and then after they leave lane and are farming in side lanes by themselves, he hits 100 CS more. If you actually think that's a flame horizon, you are aware it's optional to keep living, right? You don't need, just because you're suffering and in a dark hole of despair, to ruin our lives as well, right? That was never what a flame horizon was. You haven't flame horizoned Flame. He is just in his base, and you are now just farming against no one. You have flame horizoned a PvE map with no one in but you and bots. Like, that's not a flame horizon. So the point there is, that actually is a big flaw in the game. It's like, actually, funnily enough, this actually developed a little bit at times in Counter-Strike. I'll just give you an abstract point there, which is that in Counter-Strike, oftentimes when you had like superstar AWP players, because generally you only have one AWP player, you know, it's a very expensive gun, but it has massive impact. Generally, it's not that like the head-to-head was like the 2 best AWP players go head-to-head. I bet every round they go to the same spot and duel each other. No, because that would make the least sense of all. What usually happened was the 2 AWP players were almost like competing against each other in as much as, right, we'll just kill each other's teams. Like, we'll just wreck everyone else, and then it's only their overall performance that matters. So, second point was, I actually have always felt like this is one of the most flawed aspects of having these hard narratives around, like, right, well, in this meta, this sort of team succeeds with this sort of a player, and to have the player, if you reverse engineered it, he'd need to play these champions. Oh, what do you know? The team that won had the AD carry that played these champions in this specific way, and at the end, everyone goes, must be a better player then, as opposed to going, well, think of all the context we just built up there. So as I've said on a past episode, I'll do a whole video on this one time, I'll really go deep on it, but I don't think it is the logic that Froggen and Forgiven were morons, while Bjergsen and Reckless were geniuses, and that's why their teams won. I think if you look at it, guess what? Reckless and Bjergsen became the Froggen and Forgiven in the seasons where their style wasn't the most effective, or their picks weren't the most effective, or their way of playing wasn't the most effective. The difference is, this might sound bizarre, but one of the reasons actually that I think Bjergsen and Reckless actually went down a dark route is because they bought into the narrative themselves. They really thought that every season they were supposed to go, right, there's no sort of skills or different strengths here. I just have to learn to play however everyone's telling me to play. And then they just go to that. And then when it's not as effective, that's the one thing you can say for people like Froggen and Forgiven. You can actually put them on any team and they'll be like halfway effective because they'll just play to their strengths constantly. And if their strengths aren't like emphasized by the game, they can't win. You're absolutely right. But they'll at least always have a logic. Like, one of the things I have to say, mate, this is one of the reasons why I wish some people did more media. If you ever got those 2 players, I picked purposeful examples there, forgot Froggen and Forgiven. If you ever got those guys, if they did like a post-game vlog after every LCS match, right, and they just explained their logic for the pick, how they played it, and then what they were doing in specific game decisions, most people would like worship these guys because they always have a logic to it, right? Like, no joke, in every game Froggen's lost, he had a win condition in his mind and he was playing towards that, and he might not have won the game, but there was like a logic to it. The difference is, when you talk to people like Bjergs and Reckless, when they've had these really like disappointing games at Worlds, part of the reason why it's so depressing is because they actually still don't know why they lost the game a lot of the time. They're like, oh, well, you know, I guess I could have made a move there, but like, should I have? And I mean, you know, I know what you mean, like I lost the game, but maybe I should have picked this because a lot of other teams are picking it and it was strong, you know, like they actually by the end don't necessarily know what the win condition is. So in a weird way, I realize that's not what you were saying, Hussain, but I kind of like, it ties into what I think anyway, because I've always felt like, actually, the fact that everyone tells Bjergsen, you can do anything in this whole game, you can be any player you want and play any champion, like, I don't really think that exists except for maybe like half of Faker, and then even then I don't think Faker doing that makes as much sense as you see when he has to give up everything and just play stuff to help his whole team. It's just a worse team, you know, so isn't that kind of like a problem in how league narratives are crafted, that we're sort of telling people based on very specific context, no, you're an overall better player if you do this or you don't do it? Sounds like that plays in your philosophy somewhere on how you coach the team.
I think that sort of goes with the way I know how to coach a team. That is not necessarily the only way to coach a team.
Sure.
Like, I wouldn't employ those same styles or philosophies if I was coaching a Forgiven or a Dardoch or any of these players. Like, every player has certain restrictions. So the more flexible you can be within those restrictions, the better it is. I think Bjergsen, like players like Bjergsen are told, and partially it's true, that their restrictions allow them to be much more flexible than most players. So the expectation for them to perform across a wider range of styles is also bigger.
Okay, I have an abstract question for you then on that line before I lose you, okay? Is that if you had to write a general rule, obviously no rule can be hard and fast. It has to be general and has to then be tailored to the specifics. But if I had to make a team tomorrow, right, and someone was telling me, like, what types of players should I pick here? I wouldn't tell them pick, like, the carry who's super versatile and can do everything, and therefore let that guy, you know, switch things up. Like, I think, for example, this Worlds, it kills me inside that anyone tries to, like, critique Faker for this Worlds as though it's in any way his fault he failed. He did the opposite. He actually, by applying his ridiculous versatility, let his team get way further than they should have, and then allowed himself to look bad. Like, in any sane world, he would have just looked amazing, and everyone would have gone, well, obviously his team had no way to win the fucking Worlds. Look how shit they were at the tournament, right? Well, in that sort of scenario, I think it's actually worse to take a really versatile player and use them to cover the weaknesses of players who aren't very good. If I had to pick, I'd rather have my superstars play to their strengths and then have a really versatile, supportive player who himself shifts up what he does and then as a result sacrifices and looks bad, but then we win the fucking game because he's covering someone else's weakness who's the star, you know.
The problem with League is that works within, like, in a lot of metas, you can't be that restrictive. Like, even Faker, if Faker had winning matchups at Worlds, the amount that you get from winning matchups at Worlds, in the sense that, like, how much you lose from being on his losing side is not a lot. So maybe he'd get like a slightly bigger advantage than most people would get in a matchup, but it wouldn't be enough to win a game. And in other metas, his counter pick would literally win the game for SKT.
Sure. Yes.
So that's a problem with League that makes it hard to pick players like that, because you can't win, like, across the year, across multiple metas, you can't consistently win, where maybe your highs will be less with more flexible players, but your year average might be better.
Okay.
And I think SKT prescribes to, like, having, like, the best average they can have across the year, as opposed to, like, winning certain tournaments.
Sure.
And also, I think SKT just generally believes that playing that way would be their best, like, the best chance of winning Worlds. I think they believe that would give them a higher chance than having Faker on winning matchups that kept him constricted to his role, because they possibly believe that, I imagine they believe that, like, if Faker was just in his lane and everyone else had to deal with their lanes on their own, they would just get snowballed on harder.
But put it this way, okay? I mean, obviously, I'm going to have to make a ridiculous example here to get any more out of this. But put it this way, if I was in a scenario in TSM where I had the choice of telling Bjergsen, saying, oh, I can play all these things as well, but in doing so, we free something up for Biofrost or Svenskeren, and I would just say, well, don't bother doing that. Like, that's not be silly, you know? In this scenario, it sounds like you go against that.
So this Worlds, for example, like, we suffered from this. We didn't play Galio mid, and Galio was one of those champions where it didn't matter how good or bad you were as a mid laner, or how bad or good your side lanes were. If you had this champion and the other person had a champion that had to stick in lane, it was really hard to play against. It was practically impossible. And so if it's to that extreme as it was at Worlds, then yes. But if it's to the point where it's like Cassio versus Ryze, both stay in lane sort of, and it's small leads, I would always take the counter pick in that situation. So to me, it always depends on like how abusive.
So then, how would you relate that back to the TSM example? Then they should, in theory, have catered the game to some degree around Bjergsen. At least he should have been the central concept, right?
I think like I still believe to this day against us that they should have last picked mid, because they should have been confident enough in their side lanes against us to, if they do believe their players are better, where like they don't need Bjergsen to take a hit so that Hanser can have a wing matchup against Alfari. Yes. Like the only way that makes sense to me is if they believe that Hanser was that much better than Alfari, or they underrated Alfari. But he's one of the few Western players, I think, that understands how to play from the losing side of a matchup, and it's either terrible planning or overconfidence in what they can do.
Okay.
Like against us, 100%, I think they should have gone after mid lane.
Okay, Kelsey, I've got another angle for this. Yeah. Did you have something you need to say now?
Yeah, I just think I would kind of agree to an extent that winning matchups in isolation don't do that much, but I actually think that having a winning matchup with a player who knows what to do with like any kind of lead to extend it between lanes to jungle, whatever, is really huge. And that's why a lot of these early game sort of compositions ended up being successful for teams like Misfits, for some of the Korean teams towards the end of the tournament as well. And I think that for Faker, it's not just like the Galio itself, but it's just his ability to use that champion to impact the map really, really effectively. Bjergsen, I think he's an extremely talented player, but when he would, and because he could get these leads a lot or managed to get priority a lot, but the problem is that he had very, like when he pushed out the minions and went to do something with his advantage, he had very specific small things that he would do, like he would ward the enemy raid camp, or he would do something with fake pressure, but he didn't necessarily do a lot with his advantages. And so that's kind of what makes me feel like he didn't giving him the counter pick wouldn't have necessarily been the right course of action. And I do think that they had problems with Hanser and stuff, but at least like they had this idea of when we get to mid-late game, he'll be in a side lane. And there were a couple of times, I think in the first game, where this even worked against you, where they had bottom pushed out and they managed to use that to collapse mid very effectively. So I think that that's kind of like where they went with that, and that's why they chose the counterpick top idea rather than the counterpick mid. Okay, and that's a limitation of their team.
Quick question on this then. If that is, if what you say is accurate, then shouldn't you have been a more vocal critic of Bjergsen? It sounds like he can't. Like, how is he the best Western mid laner if he doesn't know how to basically take a lead and apply pressure from it?
It's very weird because when I watch TSM, they get a lot out of Bjergsen pushing out the leg or having priority. Like they're able to do more invades, they're able to do more stuff on the side. Like their ganks go better because obviously the enemy mid laner can't match or anything like this. But that doesn't necessarily, so to me, it feels like they get so much out of Bjergsen, but then you see the limitations of that when, in the fact that the team itself is not coordinated and Bjergsen isn't working with his lanes or his jungle as well as some of these other mid laners. So it gets to this point where, okay, what he's able to do and what the team's able to do with what he can do is very effective domestically, but other teams that are better coordinated with their jungler and everything else, it falls short. So yeah, okay, in that sense, you can be more critical of Bjergsen, I agree.
But doesn't that imply that they had the option of giving Bjergsen the counter pick, or they had the option of going with Hanser having the counter pick, and they believe they could do more with Hanser?
I think it just made more sense, thought that they could get more out of like having top lane counter pick. And I think if you have this view of the meta that I'm assuming they did, it makes sense that, okay, what we get is we have mid push, but what that does is it helps our side lanes to an extent, or it helps our jungler to an extent. Whereas as the game goes on, as the game goes later, which is where our strengths actually are as a team, I think you would acknowledge that TSM are a little bit better at setting up later on than they are and playing like these comeback team fights, as you also acknowledged at the start of the show. Yep. Then if that's your strength, then you want to be able to have like a consistent pressure lane as the game goes on. And so you want a side laning top laner who is really good in this kind of matchup. And so if that's the counter pick option, then you go for that. So
okay.
And it's also easy to critique TSM on like not counter picking mid as well, but it's not so simple, because I know that if we lost mid jungle, we would really struggle in games. But there's no way for TSM to know that, because the only time it happened on stage was G2, and our jousting against G2 were so bad that it's really hard to gauge that as an actual weakness. And then on top of that, if they're not seeing anything like that in scrims, then it's really hard to come up with that plan for game one. I think for the tiebreaker, they should have tried it, because why not? But I understand them not trying it for the group stage games.
Okay. By the way, that's also, as a very, very small sidebar, just because maybe it'll lead into something, I'll remember it myself by saying it out loud. Another factor as well of that whole like Band-Aid approach that I think has really cost TSM is like, even though they do a really good job of knowing what Koreans say when they win a game, where when Koreans win a game, they'll still be like critical of themselves, like, nah, I could have done something better here, or, you know, I should have won earlier in the game. When TSM do that, whenever I've watched all their interviews and whenever I've spoken to some of them, I actually never bought the notion that they believed that. Like, I think part of their problem is this: when things go badly, then they change things because they think we've got to change it immediately. And a negative of that can be, if you are results orientated, you change something that actually was working, it just didn't work in that game. But even worse, if you are results orientated, it goes the other way, doesn't it? Which is that you did something, as you're saying here, you won against World Elite, but did you actually win against World Elite? Did you just win in the game, but you played worse and you fucked up a lot, but it happened to win? Or did you actually play better than them and you won as a result of that? Like, that's where I sometimes wonder about TSM. Like, I think shit sometimes just works for them and they go, oh, that works. It's like, it doesn't, does it? Like, worked in that one game, or it worked temporarily. It's not going to keep working continually. And I feel like they got way too sucked into that as a general point, bizarrely.
Yeah, I can agree with that. I think it's also like, it's hard to fault TSM because like they shouldn't go the other way where they, for example, they can't rely on Hanser. Like if they feel confident in Hanser being able to perform in a certain matchup, they should pull it out on stage and they should do it. Sure. And they've probably had success at scrims with it. So they're not doing it, you know, as a slight to Bjergsen as much as confidence in a player that they've seen perform. But
it is a bit bizarre though, right? In the context that essentially this is what tilts me, right? Is that the entire premise of how all those discussions go, which aren't real discussions, they're just arguments of fans telling me I'm wrong, between whether Hauntzer is the best top laner in the NA region, always go like this. I always manage to narrow it down to the concept that generally the best top laners can carry like fuck, and then when I get people there, and I've trapped them with that logic, and they've agreed in any context, I then say, well, if we look, Hauntzer does not carry that often or even get put on carries, so even his own team does not think he is the best or the best way to win. And people always counter with the logic that, yes, but every now and then he does get to carry and he carries the game. And I always say, yes, but that is the problem, isn't it? They don't do that because it is not even in their team the best way to win. But bizarrely, at Worlds, they do put Hauntzer on these carry picks. They do put him in position to do that. He doesn't carry the game. They lose the game. And do you know what everyone says? Yeah, but look how good he looked in a losing effort. Exactly the logic I'm not allowed to then apply to all the players who are losing to Hauntzer, who I consider to be better. So, as usual, the fans have had their cake, eaten it. They're Americans, so they've had another cake as well. And they continue to eat the cakes while claiming to never gain any weight. And meanwhile, I'm out of cakes, even though I've earned the cake. So, here's the question along those lines then, is... this will sound like an abstract point, right? This isn't just like a lawyer approach to trip you up, but I think it's a genuinely real principle, right? One of the things I feel sorry for everyone in League of Legends is why I actually think coaches are some of the hardest done by in League of Legends, because you do get judged literally on the placing that your team has at the end of the split. You don't even get judged on how much they improve, etc. Like if you're on a top team, you must win. That's it. You cannot remain a coach if your team doesn't win and you're on one of the top LCS teams. You just look at history, it shows. Yet, you obviously have so many limited opportunities for this kind of final exam. It happens at the end of each split, or it happens at Worlds. If you like, what's bizarre is by passing the split one, sometimes you fuck yourself up because then you have to go to the international competition and prove you can win there. So the part about that I think sucks is in games like CSGO and Dota, your final exam comes every month and a half. Like, if you actually fuck up once, you can absolutely improve for the next one. And in fact, fucking up once or twice might be what then pushes you, by just sheer pressure, to fix something that then makes you the very good team for the third and fourth time, and then everything's forgiven, right? But the problem here is that you never get to see what happened. You never get a control group for all your results. You never get to run it back next month. So, for example, okay, I can tell you from watching lots of these Dota and CSGO tournaments, what tends to happen with upset teams is they come along in a tournament, and nearly always the reason why it's an upset is they're the team that everyone's paying the least attention to. No one knows them. No one rates them highly. No one puts in any extra amount of effort. And when you're practicing, yes, generally you're going to put aside a similar amount of practice, but you are focusing more, if you're TSM in the group that they were in, on WE. You're focusing mainly on WE. Obviously, Misfits a bit after that because Flash Wolves is a bit dodgy, but even then, you're probably actually giving Flash Wolves more credit than the public does because they've got Carcer and Maple, and that plays into some of your weaknesses. So ultimately, yeah, you're trying to spread out your focus, etc., but you haven't got that much to go off because Misfits wasn't that good in the summer split. You've got series against very specific opponents. As you mentioned there, you can't really take too much away from the G2 one because part of you even thinks, is that even how they're going to play? They were in a big final. Some of the players probably got the pressure to them, There's no real blueprint. Meanwhile, every single team in that group, the first thing they did on their whiteboard is like, number one, focus. Let's find out how to beat TSM. Let's prepare for TSM. Let's scout all the games where TSM wins. We know what their blueprint to success is. Every team's putting in maximum effort there. Meanwhile, if we had 4 more tournaments and Misfits turned out to be really good, you'd be getting the same treatment. So either you would turn out to be amazing, or people would find out how to counter you, how to neutralize you, how to put you on the back foot, which is what happens in all these other games, which is the point I was making, which is that what happens is the team that has the upset nearly always in the next 2 or 3 tournaments immediately regresses to the mean, purely because people then put the appropriate pressures on them that they can't respond to because they're not actually that good a team. So I'm not saying that's 100% there, because actually within the context of my own logic, I don't have a control group. I can't say I know that Misfits would have done worse, but does this not play any kind of a role? I mean, it sounds like from what you're saying that no one really could have known what Misfits was going to do in most of the official games.
It definitely plays a role, but so, say for 2017 we had 4 majors in league.
Yes.
And you had NA and EU teams in it. In my opinion, G2 would be number 1, TSM would be number 2, and then like Fnatic number 3. We wouldn't be on there. But if you go into the second half, in the second 2 majors of the year, I think we would have performed better than TSM. And it's hard to see that improvement in both the league structure and in this because it kind of happens out of nowhere. But you would have more tournaments to see to judge a team on for the whole year.
Yes. Where
you can't do that in league. So well,
here's the sad thing, Hussain. In a way, you can. Like, if you wanted to kind of backdoor it and find a way, you'd have to find a way. This is the part that no one's cracked, is what metric can we use to give credit to people's regular season results without then tying them into the playoff result? That's the problem. It's obviously a different type of play. And so no one's really figured out. Everyone either just says regular season doesn't matter, because ultimately it doesn't if you then lose in the playoffs, or they do what the most pleb fan does, which is they think it matters as much. And then they go, oh, but in the regular season, this team won a game like this, so of course they could have won this game at Worlds, and that's not really that reasonable either. So I feel like no one's kind of figured out what to do mentally with the regular season, right?
Well, there's like, the thing is, if you ever go into any tournament structure, every team goes in with the same goal. And so you never have to question why the teams are there.
Yes.
And with regular season, you have 10 teams and you have to question all of their motives for what it is for regular season. And there's no team in Europe that goes on stage and tries stuff and fails at it. Like, usually what you see on stage is what teams believe they'll have the best chance of winning that week with. But it's also the stuff that they've practiced most that week. And what they've practiced might be a weakness. So they've been practicing a weakness of theirs and they've gotten really good at it, and they believe that'll get them the best chance for that week since it's the most practiced. But that also doesn't mean it's the best way the team plays. Where in a tournament structure, every team will try to play to their strengths at all points. And so it's impossible to read how good a team is because the intentions that they have for like 6 out of the months that they play is completely different for each
Let
team.
me give you a different way of saying it, Pat, and see if you agree, or maybe I've missed something here. But isn't one of the problems here that in a week of LCS, cause except towards the end, the weeks of LCS don't really determine your entire split. The reason why I can practice a weakness and then play it in an official game is because if I then find out, yeah, that still doesn't work, I can then go and fix it. The difference is in a series, there is no time to fix anything. So actually, I have to go with my best shot now, and if something's not going to work, got to find another way to use one of my strengths because there's no practice time. We're playing the next game right after. In a way, that's it, right?
Like, yeah, I agree with that completely. In a best of, you see the best a team has to offer, and in a league system, you don't till playoffs. And it makes it, if there's not more international tournaments, it makes it really hard to judge a team internationally. Like, it's not hard to have a discussion about what the best teams in Europe were for 2017 because the league system is fine for that. But internationally, it's really hard to. Like, I'm not saying we're a better team than TSM. I just don't think it's so clear cut.
Well, here's the one thing I'll also say as someone with experience from other games, so I kind of have some actual experiments run that people won't who just watch League. Another flaw which will always exist in League is that I don't blame people who use funnily enough, it comes from MMA. It's called MMA math, right? Which is where if A beat B, then A would beat C because B beat C. It's like that doesn't actually work because obviously it's stylistic, matchup dependent, depending on when they played. There's a million factors. But the part that doesn't make any sense about that is that what people do every single year in League is they just find out who the best Western team is and go, right, that means their region's better and therefore the other teams from the region. So for example, if H2K played close to G2, then if G2's better than TSM, then H2K wowould beat Immortals. Like there's literally almost no basis to make that point. It's so abstract. Once you get down to the actual details, there's nothing. It just disappears into thin air. It's a mirage. But the problem is, people do think that way, whereas actually, while you have to use results because their results are clues, they're never actually telling you it's not like hard evidence as to what it happened. It's a clue, It's more like a circumstantial piece of evidence. Maybe that hints at something. But ultimately, you should judge who the best teams were on how they played, not the result of the game, right?
I completely agree with that. But that's also why I think that in the second half we were better than TSM. I think we played better.
You said it's not clear cut, but I would go. I think we are just saying 4 worlds, right? TSM versus Misfits.
Yeah.
I think in that sense, it is pretty clear cut just based on what they were playing, what they were practicing. That Misfits is better. It's weird.
Okay,
because,
but within the context, though, right? This is the part. Okay, let me ask you this then. I'll ask both of you this then. So the part that actually, the reason why that doesn't entirely sit with me, that way that you can leave the sentence it showed that Misfits were better, is that it implies that people actually actually have figured out why TSM did badly. And as far as I can tell, if you look at everyone's answers for why TSM did badly, it's more like they just know what they didn't do right. I don't think everyone's actually identified. That's why they've had these problems over and over again.
I think that the gaps in TSM's play are pretty clear, but it's just about them finding a way to learn and fill in those gaps. And I think that that's the part that they struggle with. But the flaws and the differences between Misfits and TSM in terms of how they're playing their setup, for me, the most glaring weakness for TSM is that, we've heard parts A that they think of play in terms of setup, execution, reset, but it's almost like when you watch a TSM game, after they finish the reset part, they think that there's a break and they don't continue the play. They don't consider the reset part of the play or a way to get an advantage on the next play.
They probably just need some sort of sports psychologist to tell them that 20 minutes is really the money period, that's where you kind of make your money.
It's this isn't the reset isn't a time to go just
get murked.
Take a gromp break or something. It's about oftentimes getting wards on the map so that you can press this advantage further. So I think that this is just an aspect of TSM that is a little stodgy, is that a lot of their plays just feel disconnected in themselves and they don't necessarily feed into what they're going to do next. And Misfits, I feel and also they set up plans they have wards on this blue buff, but then for whatever reason, even though Misfits are bottom, they're not doing anything with taking this blue buff. They're just kind of standing around and waiting for something to happen. It's like they have these plans and they don't go through to them. So it's just, for me, there are very clear things that TSM did not do as well as Misfits. And that's why looking at their games, even if you see, okay, this is a game that Misfits lost to TSM, really their record is 2-1. That's not really a definitive anything. But if you look across all of their games and they played a tiebreaker, basically TSM could have gotten out of that group. But if you look at the games across the group stage definitively, TSM screwed up a lot of these plays way more than Misfits did, or a lot of fundamental things.
The funny thing is, this is I'll give you a way to rephrase that actually shows why it doesn't really make sense to just think that the game saying you won with a victory screen tells you played better than someone. Because actually TSM didn't have to do anything else. TSM was in no way required to win 2 out of 3 games against Misfits. All TSM had to do to play the exact same way in 5 of the 6 games, but be in the scenario where they're the ones in the playoffs, is just lose 1 less game against Flash Wolves. That's it. Like, it never had anything to do with it. So, by the way, in that world, TSM would have gotten out of the group, Misfits wouldn't, but that doesn't mean that TSM somehow, for that 1 game result, let's say make 5 minutes of the game different, that wouldn't have meant TSM played better. So actually in that scenario, I've given you a fair example of how TSM would have been in the playoffs, but they wouldn't have played better, because obviously that's such an inane way of judging it, because as a result, the ultimate example of this obviously is that anyone who's under the impression that Cloud9 really was the best Worlds team, each Worlds, is like, you just don't understand the basic context of results, do you? Because they're not. They just get these ridiculous groups, and then they don't do very, very well in any of the tournaments, funnily enough. They just don't do that badly. What's weird is they just don't totally shit the bed, and by not shitting the bed, everyone's like, oh, you're amazing. It's like, well, not really, you know. We don't go the other way either and actually ever threaten to do anything, you know. The difference is, if TSM ever got their shit together with any of these last 2 lineups, they could have fucking made the top 4 or maybe made the final. Cloud9 could have only done what they did now, best case scenario, pretty much.
I agree with that.
Sure. Not really as contentious an episode as I'd expected, Hussain. I thought you were going to fucking come at me with some shit.
I was just like, I think...
Thankfully, you didn't go the LS approach, like, unless you are a coach, you cannot understand why Power of Evil is doing that. Because, you know, by the way, I've got the ultimate counter to that. I mean, I don't know why people still try it, mate. They still try it after years of so many insight. Like, I will never be beaten on that front, because I can always go with this angle. Doesn't matter why he did that. This is the outcome. So if the outcome isn't good, you can have a million, like, moral reasons as to why, oh, yeah, that was a moral victory. You know, he sort of played it right, but he lost. Like, if you keep losing ridiculously, ultimately, we don't have to actually know why. We just know it's wrong.
Do you, Do you think that TSM has better players than, or had better players than the previous roster?
Oh, you mean the one that just broke up?
Yeah.
Then Misfits, yeah, for sure.
Is that
I think, funnily enough, TSM. Like, this might sound weird, because it might sound like, after all the different angles we've taken and people whose views we've aired and all of how fair, in a weird way, I actually do mainly blame in TSM Reginald. The old classic. I always have that in like a little red box next to me, you know, break in case of emergency. Well, just break every year when TSM goes out of Worlds, to be fair. It's more like a fucking sort of like advent calendar I open every Worlds. So the reason why I say I blame Reginald is because, first of all, like, in a weird way, the buck should always stop if a company or an organization succeeds or fails with whoever has the ultimate power in that organization. Now, that can seem unfair, because sometimes you have an owner or a head of an organization where the reason he succeeds and gets credit is because he picked the right person and then just got out of that guy's way and let him do everything right, which is, by the way, a very intelligent way to go. If you actually ever go and look, as a little sidebar for org owners, if you ever go and look at the way a lot of billionaires continue to be billionaires and become tens of billionaires, is because they tend to go, the way I became a millionaire is I was super good at this one thing or in this one area. Now that I am expanding and trying to do other things, I will get other people who are super good in those areas and very talented and let them do what I did in my small sense. And now all these people in my company are doing genius things and brilliant innovation and designing things. And as a result, collectively, my brand gets to be that we're the best. It's not like Steve Jobs really thought up every fucking product and had all the decisions, right? He didn't. He did a very good job getting that fucking Johnny Ives guy, for example. So the point I'm making here is, I feel like actually a lot of TSM's flaws come from whatever concept Reginald has of how League of Legends is played, that whether he explicitly says it or not, clearly gets enforced on whoever is the coach of TSM, and by trickle-down Reginomics, gets fucking enforced on all the players who join TSM, who have a... Here's the mad thing. Reginald actually succeeded in a way almost no Western team ever has, in that he actually did introduce the first true team culture to a League of Legends org. The flaw is the team culture is Reginald, and so unfortunately Reginald's flaws are the team culture flaws, whereas normally when you introduce the culture, you want it to be from someone who's like a legendary coach in a sport, you know, and he gives them like a defensive mindset, and so we're always going to play this way, and you know, the offense doesn't have the same pressures on them because we know the defense is going to, you know, what's mad is he's done the good job of implementing the culture. He just didn't do it consciously, if that makes sense. It sounds like an abstract point, but I think there's actually a very key element to it, because to me, almost every Worlds I've seen TSM teams play at, they have been limited compared to domestic. Every single one. Go back years and years. They're never as good. And part of the reason why is this. They have this set notion of how they're going to play. And so what's bizarre is you get a player who could have done so much more, could have been amazing. Like, put it this way, if you give me this team, I'm not saying I could coach it, but if you give me the team, and if you give me Parth as well, I would tell Parth something different. I think he would do something different with the squad.
There's an interesting point to be made here as well, is that I feel like a lot of people incorporate what a player... It's really hard to separate what a player knows about the game with how good the player is individually. And a lot of people say, well, why would you want to do that? Isn't like game understanding a big part of being a player and doing these types of things successfully? But I think you can break those down into elements of maybe Svenskeren has a little bit better like mechanical strength than Maxlor. So then do you say that Svenskeren is a better player than Maxlor based on that criteria? Well, I think that Maxlor is one of the smartest junglers in the West. So it depends on how you rate those things. And that's the point where you get to like judging players becomes difficult and an interesting discussion. So
okay, let me ask you this though, to elucidate that further, right? I would say in a way you picked kind of a bit of an easy example there, because you picked the jungler, and I have actually even done a video on this very topic. Funnily enough, by the way, I inadvertently predicted what happened to Peanut when he joined SK Telecom, which is that probably the most overrated position to have mechanics at is the fucking jungler, isn't it? Like the game isn't even about that in most cases, and obviously unless they make shit like Lee Sin available to play, you're not going to be outplayed. They're not going to be having Lesic Insec outplays. That's about 4 years ago, mate. Nowadays you are going to be servicing your lanes and trying to get your team to a reasonable position of vision control. So the amount of mechanics to drop a ward, not that high. I realize Skara failed it like 7 times, but generally it's not that tough to do. You know, so the point is, for jungler, I think the mechanics one fails, because if anything, I think actually jungle has proven that it's actually better to have the guy who's smart at reading the map and knows what his teammates need. Whereas the difference is, I don't think that it's as hard and fast for the different roles. Like personally, I think you'd have a hard time ever convincing me that High was ever better than Bjergsen or Froggen or fucking Febervern or Perks or any of these. It doesn't matter if he actually had a bigger impact on the game for me, a shot caller, etc. As an individual player, I don't think you ever can if you're much worse mechanically. I don't know that smarts ever just win out in the same way. You know, for me, it wins out a bit more in the jungle position.
Well, let's use the Bjergsen Power of Evil example then, because I think Bjergsen is actually an insanely gifted and talented, and just like has worked really hard to keep those elements of his ability very high. But as you asked me earlier, do I think I overrate Bjergsen because he hasn't done as much with his lead in terms of like making the right map moves or working with his team better? But for me, that's a really difficult question to answer, because I feel like if Bjergsen had tools that allowed him to make these decisions better, he would be actually just an insane monster player. Then that's a point where in my mind I don't think Power of Evil can reach that point. So
well, put it this way, okay, there's a reason why Power of Evil had success in teams that are generally like, he is one of the star players. They are teams that aren't necessarily the best players around him. They are players who there's no intimidation factor with these teammates, and there's a reason why when he went to Origin it fell apart completely. The difference is, I think you could put in this exact example, I think you could put Bjergsen on all types of teams and he'd still be very good. So in a weird way, I guess I am saying that I think that these players are better than, like, for example, okay, are you ready for the true heresy, Hussain? Like, I can't say it for the position of jungle, because as I said, like, I actually do think being smart is really important. That's why I think mechanical junglers who their whole career is based on, like, fucking look at the sick mechanic. Like, I think that's the most flawed shit to ever have, you know? Like, the whole reason why I used to hype Rush wasn't mechanics. It was the fact that, like, I actually do have a philosophy that if you can win as much as someone like that does from jungle in Korean solo queue, you do have some insane ability to just very quickly make decisions and read the game. Like, I don't think you do that just off mechanics, mate. There's so many good players in Korea. So I don't think that makes a lot of sense. It's the same reason why I'm with LS. I actually think if Apto ever actually played competitively, somehow he would become a monster, because you just look at the way he plays the game. He's got insane ability to read the game. But with that said, I could absolutely make a case that, like, if you put, okay, so which did you pick? You thought
Ignar, Alfari, and Maxlar.
Alfari and Maxlar. Ignar. See, I actually might go ahead and say that if you gave them, okay, so in 5 seasons from now, Biofrost will have been a better support player than Ignar. Ignar seems more limited to me. So, for example, to give the earlier example I gave, I would say right now, now's the time to sell on that Ignar stock. It's at the highest point. Whereas the difference is, now's the time to buy the fuck out some Biofrost, because now is the period when he actually might do the Mako arc, where you no longer are in the shadow of someone who was really good, and you actually just legitimately have to become good yourself and become really good with perhaps a worse player.
See, the problem with that is, if you look at every support Doublelift has played with before Biofrost,
Yes.
Like, he's had some pretty bad supports outside of Afromu and Chowster way back when.
Basically all of them except for Season 2 Chowster, yes.
Yeah, and he was always, like, that 2v2, no matter what support he had, his 2v2 was always really strong.
Yes.
And I don't think on TSM, I can't speak so much domestically, but at least internationally, their 2v2 seemed really weak. And I know Kelsey mentioned earlier that they're quite often out of sync of each other, but I find that a weird characteristic considering Doublelift's history. And I would have to, I would assume that some of that is on Biofrost either as a player or as a personality, more so than Doublelift necessarily falling off that much in skill.
Well, I mean, this is to me a massive flaw that Doublelift has had as a player, which is that the times he is at his best, I would still argue, like, I realized in TSM because he was winning, everyone could say he was at his best, but I actually thought he was always at his best when he had a really smart support who led the lane, basically. And then what happened was, they let Doublelift be Doublelift, and then they sort of filled in the gaps where he's not as strong. That's why I used to get so... You know, it's one of the things that tilted me the most last season, Season 6, was everyone telling me all day long about what a great fucking shot caller Doublelift is and how he reads the macro game so well. It's like, shut the fuck up. Like, in no sense does he. Like, get me some fucking comms right now where he's making these sick calls and reads. Like, he's not, is he? I mean, half the time, Doublelift just does that shit where... Like, he's the ultimate guy where... Like, this is also another thing we discussed on that coaching episode, which I absolutely agree with, is like, you never coach the whole team altogether. Like, certain people should only hear information on a need-to-know basis. Like, aside from, okay, whenever I watch TSM Legends, right, this is how I watch the show, okay, because it's just a soap opera to me. It's not a fucking anything in reality. When I watch the soap opera, I've already said this on Summer Inside, my favorite character, Reggie, obviously, because I love when he comes in. He's sort of like Kramer. He comes in and just fucks up everything, you know, but in such an, you know, he's such an irascible character, you know, you gotta love him. He comes in, he fucks everything up with his Season 2 knowledge of the game, telling Dyrus what boots to buy in Season 5, etc. Classic bants. But then my second favorite character is Doublelift the Analyst, because I love it when they lose a game and they're all sat there looking at the ground, you know, trying to do what, you know, like what I think it was the Catholics used to call like an examination of the soul. You know, you go through all the things you've done wrong, how you've slighted God, Reggie, and the shame that you've brought upon the TSM name, you know. You think about all those things in your mind, and then, you know, the sort of associated guilt of knowing how much you get paid by Reggie, and therefore, you know, whatever Reggie say goes. And then after Reggie's finished reaming you out, Doublelift then plays sort of the straight man to Reggie in that sense, and he just goes like, well, all we did wrong is this, and then in 3 sentences, he destroys everything a coach could ever have succeeded in, because he just tells you like 3 things that like just obviously on a results orientated basis didn't work, and then puts the word just all the time around that. Whereas, you know, just is probably the most misused word in the English language, in my opinion, because if you notice, most people use the word just for things that are anything but just. They'll be like, well, TSM just had to like build a better infrastructure. Like, are you fucking kidding me? That's the hardest thing to do. You know, TSM just had to get like this player who choked not to choke. Like, so fix a human being's mind for the sake of a fucking video. You know, these are like the hardest things to do. And Doublelift is the worst defender I've ever seen of that. Like, to this day, like, he's the guy where you could even tell him, yeah, but, you know, think about this really abstract point. And he'd go, yeah, you have a point. But I think we just had to do this. It's like, yep, you don't learn. Like, okay, back to that again. So explain this to me then. I agree. I probably don't think Bifrost had a lot of input there, and he probably to some degree was led by Doublelift. And I have implied by the Mako example, I think he probably got overrated as a result. Personally, I always thought Bifrost was... I never knew what the fuck he was doing in those teams. He just seemed like his number one job was don't fuck up the game as Doublelift tells you not to. Like... Are we going in? Yeah. He tells we're going in, we're going in. Like, that's your job, basically. But, actually, where was I going with that? Let me think. But how does that relate to Ignar, then? Do you have some special insight on Ignar that makes him different in that respect?
Here's the thing. Like, I agree with you that Doublelift performs best when there's a support that can lead the lane and then is smart about the game.
Like, put it this way, I always thought... Support. I realized, like, I've always said I never blamed them for the Yellow Star recruitment because I know that's what they thought they were getting from Yellow Star. So I actually always will give... what's funny is I might even give Reggie, that might be one of his best recruitments ever, because he really did look like he'd fixed the team. But I have to say this, and I'll call them out right now. I know a couple of seasons ago that Mithy absolutely would have snapped their hand off to join TSM. TSM did not recruit him because they said, haha, you are a racist, due to that fucking shit that went down years ago when he got banned, right? And even though at the time, everyone used to tell me, you should stop sucking Mithy's dick. I was like, if you knew anything about him and his teammates, the guy's unreal, right? And he was literally, it's almost like you tailor-made someone who could make Doublelift fucking unleash all this potential. Because you have someone who can lead the lane, is super smart about macro, syncs up with everyone else in the team, plays a shot calling role, studies the opponent, and on top of that, has himself a very strong personality where he's then going to battle with you over the things he doesn't agree with. Whereas obviously in this setting, a lot of the supports that actually make Doublelift look good but not that great are the ones who just kind of acquiesce to whatever Doublelift wants, you know. But and obviously they could have had him.
That's my issue with Bifrost over Ignar, because their 2v2 internationally has never been strong, and he's not offering what Afromoo or Chaucer have to Doublelift. Whereas Ignar, like, our 2v2 has generally been really strong, especially like internationally as well, and domestically. And Ignar is the one that leads the lane and quite often dictates the pace of the game, or sorry, of the lane and of vision. Like, if you look at a game of Misfits and you look at what Ignar is playing, you could point to very clear aspects of our game that revolve around Ignar. But when I look at what Bifrost does for TSM, I don't know anything that he offers that other support players cannot offer. Like there's nothing unique about him.
Is this too harsh? If I wound back the clock and I just threw like Adrian onto the exact same team, you could probably have very similar results, right?
Yeah.
Not much would need to change.
Yeah.
The one thing I'll give Biofrost is I think that it's my understanding that he has improved like a great deal in a short amount of time based on what we've seen, and then he'll be a little short to learn something, but he will learn it, and he will try very hard to be an extremely flexible player. Whereas I feel like Ignar
also only played 3 splits, so fair enough, you know.
Yeah, and I feel like Ignar has definite areas where he's comfortable, and either he didn't want to or the team didn't feel it necessary to, like, because I forget, it was spring even when certain supports were like very good and he was still playing like tanky stuff, and even like it was very clear from your drafts that this was some kind of limitation that you were either he was imposing or you were imposing on the team. So I think that like from that regard, that's why the support role is still like kind of hard, because I can see Biofrost being a better player and more useful to the team from that regard if like he's able to flesh himself out and transcend metas. Because I think that like probably the most important things for players as like the infrastructural side, the staff side, just the coaching side, and the better ways to understand the game develop in the scene. The most important stuff is just going to be like willingness, attitude, the wanting to just really be hungry and put in the time, and then just like the baseline mechanical ability. So from that regard, and in any role, even in jungle, because you can teach a lot of stuff like that. So I think from that side, then yeah, you could make an argument for Bifrost.
Like, I actually think so. Like, since you mentioned Adrian, Bifrost is definitely more flexible and has seemed way more open to coaching based on like what we hear from TSM at least. And so there's strength in him in the sense that he's improved quite a bit since he started, and he clearly has a lot of potential. But at the same time, like, I still feel like what Ignar does now, even if it's limited to some extent, even within those limitations, he does a lot more than what Bifrost does with his flexibility. And to me, that makes him a better player.
Fair enough. I mean, put it this way, I actually think that now that Ignar's gone back to LCK, I mean, he might have joined a slightly worse team, but I think he's about where he should be. Like, I don't think that guy will be a top support in LCK in any universe. Like, I think he'll just emerge as just a player. I don't think, there's only a 1 in a million is going to do the fucking core JJ and actually go and in theory be half decent and then have people tell you that turns out you were good all along, as they usually do for some sad reason. Meanwhile, I actually do think that now is the career arc where Bifrost does, as I said, the Mako basically. I think he actually just becomes better year on year, and about 3 years in, he might be the best NA support player. I could see that happening. The problem is, in those settings, that's also another reason why League's very weird, because you can stay with a whole team for an entire year, and that's just default, actually. So, like, in Bifrost's case, he's only played with one AD carry, that's it. But, I mean, in any kind of reasonable context of competition. So, actually, he's never explored any of the other aspects himself. Like, I actually think in an ideal world, you do put him with an AD carry who's not some superstar player. Like, obviously not, they wouldn't choose to do that, but that is what will happen for him to develop more, which is actually what I think will happen next split.
Like, weirdly enough, I think Bifrost and Stixxay will be a better duo and a setup than Bifrost and Doublelift ever were.
Well, the funny thing is they've both come at the thing from the same angle, right? They've both gotten overrated based on who they played with, and now let's put them both together and this is like someone took fucking like Oates from Hall and Oates, and then like that guy who was in Wham with George Michael, and they were like, why don't we put the two of you in a band? Neither of you are star singers or anything. Let's see how it goes. Right, okay, wait a second though, because one thing that I want to know is this: why is Alfari better than Haunter?
If I get
by the way, I'm not even going to dispute back on that. I'm not going to fight back. I mean, I do think he might be a little bit harsh, but obviously, I just want to hear this song. It sounds catchy, so I'll just sit back and enjoy.
If Alfari is given a winning matchup, Nar was a big one at Worlds, for example. Like, it's not like we put a lot of priority in his lane still. Like, we'll at least the previous roster would still often go through mid and then figure out, like, okay, if we have a winning matchup topside, we'll play topside. But it was always through mid first. And if Haunter has a winning matchup, they'll play through top lane first. In my opinion, what Alfari does with a winning matchup with less initial resources is a lot more than what Haunter's done. Like, not just in his ability to win the matchup, but also in how much pressure he applies on the map and on the other 4 players on the enemy team. Where I feel like, and I felt like this against TSM when Haunter had the winning matchup and he had a lead due to the matchup, none of us actually felt pressure from him.
Okay.
And to show the other extreme, when Huni had Jace in game 5, we kept finding picks on him, and yet he had a lot of pressure on the map. We felt a lot of pressure from him. And it's the same situation as Haunter's, and like, they gave him a winning matchup and they played to his lane. But the amount of pressure that Huni put on us is so far ahead of what we felt from Haunter in any of the 2 winning matchups. That's the first thing. And then, like I said before, like, Alfari in a losing matchup, which he was in 2 of those 3 games, in the Cho'Gath versus Jace one, yes, Nubar Maxlor did a lot to get him ahead, but Alfari also pressured the map way more than that. Like, a lot of the calls that snowballed that initial gank were Alfari. So I just see him being better on both sides of the coin.
I also think after it is on Haunter to an extent that after the initial invade that was conducted by Svenskeren based on the fact that they had pressure on that side, you had suddenly a lot of free time for Maxlor after he got his buff stolen, so you had to kind of anticipate that, okay, maybe I should ward Tribush. So that is to an extent on Haunter. The other, I think the Haunter-Huni comparison is an interesting one because Huni will as long as he has TP, he will always side lane. Like, he will just always be in side lane. Whereas I felt like Hansar had a problem where he gave up side lane pressure really easily if he thought that there was a collapse opportunity mid, which lost TSM a lot of ground and a lot of map control. So, I think it's fair to criticize him for that. This used to be a problem with Alphari, I think, but he got a lot better at it. So.
Okay. So, the bizarre thing about that is, most of the time, I mean, it's obviously the meme, most of the time Hansar does just play like a tank, and in theory he doesn't always get the favourable picks in the regular split, right? So, outside of the context of Worlds, is Alphari a better player than Hansar?
Yeah, because Alphari never, didn't get winning matchups quite often in LCS as well. Okay. And he played with even less resources in losing matchups than Hansar has. Because, for example, if Hansar, if you have a tank top like Maokai, quite often you'll have a carry jungler with him and you'll play to that lane still. We had a lot of drafts, and there's an argument about whether those drafts were good or not, but we had them, which is we had a tank jungle and a tank top, and we would play around mid and bot. So Alphari is literally on an island. He would get the Darius treatment from us. But it wasn't anywhere as extreme as what happened to Darius or any other top laner that's put in that situation.
So let me ask you this then. Does that mean that, I mean, I noticed you didn't include him in your 3 players. Does that mean that in this very specific, only in this very specific context, you agree that Hans Sama was a bit overrated at Worlds because basically part of his game is enabled by Alphari?
No, because of how I know Hans Sama functions within the team. But yes, if I was an outsider looking in. Because there have, especially during the regular split, because he had a huge upsurge in playoffs and at Worlds, so there's quite a few weeks where he's performed, and then of course I know about things like Korean boot camp, so I know how he performed against those bot lanes, and he did well. But in the regular season, he did struggle, and it's hard to say it's hard for anyone to say that Hans Sama was or should have been that good at Worlds. Within the team, between Hans Sama and Maxwell, those are the 2 biggest voices on the team, with Maxwell being in charge of early game and Hans Sama being in charge of a lot of our rotations. So, and him learning that as a rookie. So there's aspects to his game where I think next year people will hype him up or rate him much higher than they do this year. But I don't fault them for the way they rated him this year. Because it was a good first year, it wasn't a great one. Till playoffs and Worlds. Okay. Go on.
Where I think Hans Sama is a bit overrated is actually less to do with the laning phase anyway. It's more team fighting and where he positions himself. The team fights, I think he benefited from Ardent being a thing. I also feel like part of the reason why you struggled against WE is because the Chinese teams, RNG and WE specifically, were very good at getting side lane priority first and then kind of forcing you to push up mid. And then Hans Sama was often out of position in those instances, and that was where a lot of WE's comeback team fights came from. So I think that Hans Sama's problems are less laning related, I guess, and less how he matches up to other AD carries in that context, and more what he's doing as the game progresses. So
I agree on the team fight thing. We still had issues with that against World Elite, but I do think between regular season and playoffs and Worlds outside of the bot lanes of LPL, he improved on that a lot. But even at Worlds, there was improvement there. But then between him and Double, if it comes down to, do I value how much you contribute to the game in terms of shot calling and laning and every other aspect over team fighting versus how much you contribute, how much Double contributes. I don't know exactly how much Double contributes, but in our games against TSM, I think Hans Sama's laning was a lot better than Double If's. Our 2v2 was a lot better, and from watching the lane, I think a lot of that had to do with Hans Sama. And then I think in terms of shot calling, it felt like we were better than TSM as well. And I know a lot of those calls were Hans Sama's, but that's internal things. And it's up to every analyst or expert, how much they rate that versus the carry potential of Double Lift.
See, the funny thing I don't really understand is, okay, so most people, obviously that like super hot take everyone had about Doublelift at Worlds was like, oh, he saved the Flash, haha, what an idiot. And obviously he actually did a video himself where he looked at a few scenarios and he makes a pretty good case for himself, and a bunch of them that like, maybe I could have on this one, but it was sort of borderline. And on this one, I definitely shouldn't have because it was just wasted Flash and I wouldn't have had that next time. But actually what's funny is, the one sense in which I think people were right was they implied that by saving the Flash, he was greedy, like he thought he could get out of these situations. I think he was greedy, but not in that sense. Like in my sense, the reason why Doublelift fucked up Worlds was he was so greedy in lane, it was ridiculous. Like there was so many times where I actually gave this analogy. I can't remember if it was on this show or in a video where I might have been the TSM video where I actually said, if you ever got Doublelift, as like, obviously it'd have to be some like charity event where he gets coached by LS, the way LS watches your VOD back and then pauses it when he's on Skype, when he's screen sharing. Like Doublelifts would be atrocious because he actually literally breaks rules that I'm sure he even knows himself constantly, because what's bizarre is, that's why I think he has to have someone in lane to help him, because he really is the guy where it's like, if he was playing solo queue, I bet he looks fucking amazing when he does that, because I bet like the 3 or 4 games where everything works, that he's like redlining constantly, looks unreal. Like, how's he outplaying this person? Look, he like shouldn't even be able to do this in this matchup. Oh, look at this point. Like they never expected it coming because he didn't have his support with him. I bet it looks amazing. The problem is, it just doesn't make any sense on like the top level of international play to try shit like that, especially if you're on a team which has already shown like performance anxiety and people aren't going to like make all plays around you. They're just going to gradually piss the game away, And
there's also the fact that like I don't know how to judge Doublelift too much domestically because there's not a lot of competition for him domestically, but internationally, like when I say the thing about like people TSM watching their turrets fall and just standing there literally right outside the tower range, just watching it and doing nothing about it, like their bot lane was one of the biggest, like they were most responsible for that. It felt like if Doublelift was in a losing matchup or in a losing position, he had so little idea, at least at Worlds in our games, of what to do from that position, where outside of our first World Elite game, we didn't always have winning matches for our 2v2, but I felt like Steven or Hansama quite often knew what to do in both the winning and losing side of things. And he would be more willing to be proactive and be wrong than be passive and be right.
Well, maybe that actually helps me like condense it down to a sentence. I would just say this: Doublelift is, I think, actually one of the best front runners I've ever seen of any Western player. Like when he actually gets it going, like he just fucking puts it on you and he wrecks you completely. That's why he looks so sick and MVP candidate. His problem is he doesn't have a second gear. Like he can't just switch it up and go, oh wait, here's like okay, here's the analogy I always give people, okay, because it's like one of the core concepts in League way back when that tank top meta came along that helped me really understand a lot more about the game, which was, so many people who played the carry champions in that era, it was about who did the best in the game. Like the guy who snowballed fucking wrecked the other guy, and then it was like, oh, well, nothing I could do, he's snowballing me. But when all these tanks became meta, you actually got this principle, which I think a lot of fans still don't understand, which is basically that if you fuck up enough times in the first 15 minutes as the top laner, you no longer get to be a top laner. You are now building tank items. You have fucked up your portion of the game. Your job is to allow other people to have a vague chance of carrying your bitch ass out of this game and win this match. So no more, stop finishing that. Start building the fucking Randuins or whatever. Like that is your job from now on. You are a tank, no matter what champion you were playing or what situation you were in. So in that context, Doublelift is terrible when he's in these scenarios where like he has to make like a compromised call, or he has to make what is a bad call now, but it stops the bleeding later on, and you have a chance to, they never do that. Like it's weird because in lane he's doing the opposite, but it's like he fucks up to a certain point, then he just does nothing.
Yeah, I agree with that. And like the main reason I won't say Hansama and or Power of Evil are better than counterparts is because in those two positions, those two players do have certain legacies and they have performed and they have titles over an extended period of time. And for the majority of the period of time, they've been good. They've been top 3 or the best in the position. You can also imagine a
world, right, in which they're right back to being the best next year.
Yeah. And so like Hans on our team, like if he wants to, he can't just have a good performance at Worlds and be good at playoffs. He has to be good for 1 to 2 years, or better than double for 1 to 2 years, to claim that he is straight up better. Because it doesn't matter if you're better at a certain point. But with the other 3, I don't think, like, Bifrost's career is short, Ignar's career is kind of short, Alfari's 1 year, Hans's 2 years, or actually Hans's 3 years, I guess, Gravity, right? But they haven't done so much in their career. And so, like, when you compare their history to what what Alfari, Maxor, and Ignar have done, they've done so much more in so little time. And individually, I feel perform so much better than they should, given the time they spend in LCS, versus the other three, that it's easier to say that they're just straight up better.
Okay, I have one question then. Maybe this can be kind of our closing topic then. So one aspect I noticed you never commented on at any point in time was, like, from this conversation, except for my whole rant about Reginald and the TV show, no one would actually know, Hussain, that actually TSM has a coach. Like, there's actually a guy who's, like, making some of these decisions for them and in theory helping them learn the game and how they're going to play the game and coaxing people to play a certain style, or perhaps even ordering them at times. First of all, isn't it you're actually friends with that guy, right, Path?
No, I've never talked to him.
No? Okay, maybe I'm thinking of someone else then. Right? Why no critique of Path then?
I mean, I think he does have criticism on him. It's just hard to criticize coaches, first of all. But secondly,
but I mean, put it this way, like the vibe I've got from this conversation is you would have done something different with TSM that probably would have worked better, right?
It's also clear, I don't know how much, like you implied, it's pretty obvious with TSM that Reginald has a lot of control over the coaching staff and how it functions.
Sure.
Where, next year, the reason I'm excited for TSM is because not only do they have a strong core, different people with fundamentals, they have a coach that I don't think Reggie can control like that. And if he can, then that again, I think that's a mistake in how you should allow a coaching staff to function. So it's hard to criticize Part too much, because there is definitely a level of influence from Reginald, which Svenskrens openly said in an interview. So it's not a matter of debate.
Sure.
And I don't know how much of it is actually Parth versus how much of it is Reginald. So I think when you say that, it makes sense to take it up to the top with TSM. It does, because Reginald is directly involved in the coaching staff.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
I hope that next year with TSM that changes, because I think this is this year for 2018. I think Reginald has done what I think TSM should do to finally get international results.
Well, here's the thing. I will say the one aspect that I actually maybe have bought of Reginald's whole narrative about his org is that I actually, and if you notice, I do also give them a lot of leeway for Season 6, because as I say, I think he actually did try to change this. I, believe it or not, do think Season 5 went so badly at the end that he realised two things. One, I need to get a real coach, not just someone who's a really good analyst. So as in, it can't just be Parth and Loco. I've got to get someone who's actually a coach. He tried to do that by getting Casey Woodbuck. Now, if you look into it, right, yeah, you can say all this shit about, no, but he was just some guy who was a fucking pitching tutor or something like that. Yeah, but that's still better than the majority of the people who tried to just be the coaches. So I don't blame him for that. His problem was he had a double whammy. He had that fail, and then simultaneously, he then had the whole Yellow Star scenario go absolutely tits up in the worst way possible. So I think he actually tried to fix both things. One, he got someone who wasn't Doublelift, who was going to be a shot caller, wasn't Bjergsen rather. And then two, he tried to get a coach and then leave the coach to do his thing. Unfortunately, I think that's where Reginald's third weakness, which was immediately interfere when things are going badly, killed his first two decisions in a weird way, So I actually can't blame him entirely for that. And so I actually do think, in line with that, he has tried to do the same thing now, which is bring in a coach he actually thinks can do the right job, and then also, in theory, get out of his way. We'll see if the third weakness of Reginald, as I'll now dub it, comes back to destroy them again. The problem with the third weakness of Reginald as well is it initially helps every time. Like when he comes in the playoffs, he comes in after a loss, it helps. So it's sort of like we're in World War II. Apparently the Nazis were just given all that. By the way, that's right. I'm just straight comparing Reginald and TSM to the Nazis. But that's because guess
Not
what?
Again.
Nothing racial about that. I mean, there is, but then obviously he's not Aryan, is he? So it doesn't really matter. No, the point I'm making though is apparently in World War II, the Nazis gave some of their soldiers basically a version of methamphetamine. And the whole point is, if you actually were a soldier, that would help you in the short term. Like you'd stay awake, you'd be super aggro, you'd be fucking pumped. The problem with that is obviously wrecking your health, isn't it? It's just reaming you out. So that's basically what Reginald does. When he comes in, he gives you a short-term boost, much like methamphetamine. Listen, my analogy is a straight fighter tonight. And then the problem is the come down is just so fucking hard, isn't it? It just burns you out. You're left as a little burned out motherfucker. So that's TSM at the end of Worlds every year.
Holy shit, Thorin.
Hey, this is Travis Gafford, the double lift expert, and you're watching Thorin's YouTube channel.